join us. It doesn't look as though Mr. Hill's in the meeting yet, so I will continue to pause until he joins. Is there anybody from Mr. Hill's team? No?
Sir, I have Mr. Hill's email address, so I'll drop him a line now to give him
Thank you. If he's experiencing difficulties, if he'd say so, and I'll adjourn.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good morning, Inspector.
Good morning.
Yes, we are the solicitors who are instructing Mr. Hill. I've just checked with one of my colleagues, and it's possible that Mr. Hill may have thought this morning started at 10. A call is going straight across to him, and we'll just check what Mr. Hill understands, and I'll come straight back to you as soon as I've got any further information.
Thank you. I will just pause for a few moments then in that case. Thank you.
Much appreciated.
I will not send that email now.
No, don't put him under too much pressure. Hello.
Hello there. Hi. Yes, we've managed to get through to Mr. Hill's home, and someone is hopefully knocking on the door as we speak of his room to tell him to get plugged in because everyone else is waiting. So apologies, and if we can give it just a few minutes for that message to get through.
Certainly. I'll adjourn for 5 minutes and we'll retry at 9:45. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I can see Mr. Hill has now joined us. Have you had sufficient time to organise yourself, Mr. Hill?
Thank you, sir. I certainly don't want to hold anything up for any longer than I have done already, and I do apologise for the fact that I had information that we were starting at 10, and I can only offer you my profound apologies for the fact we've had a 15-minute delay.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Anyway, good morning, everyone. The inquiry's now resumed. As you know, this is the final day of the inquiry when I'll be hearing closing submissions. Just to confirm that I've received a note on the implications of the Environment Act, which I'm grateful. Various submissions on the 5-year housing land supply, and an email yesterday regarding the administration of infrared, which I've noted. I should also confirm that I carried out an accompanied site visit on the 23rd of November in excellent weather conditions, and we spent some 2 hours walking around the town centre with the aid of certain visualizations, and we were joined by 2 members of the public. Before we move on to closing submissions, can I check whether there are any matters that you wish to raise with me? No. In terms of the order of closing submissions, I was anticipating the 2 Rule 6 parties first, followed by the council, and then the appellant. Is that agreed?
Sir.
I see no dissent. Thank you. Just so we can put some structure to the day, could I ask for approximate time estimates of closing? Ms. Hall?
I think about 20 to 25 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Hill?
Very much the same for me, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Edwards?
It's about 30 to 40 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Liness?
Just under an hour, sir.
Thank you. We'll see how we progress, and we'll take a break at appropriate opportunities. If anybody needs a break at a particular time, then please let me know. I've got copies of closings already from Ms. Hall, Mr. Hill, and Mr. Edwards. Clearly, those of Mr. Liness can follow later in the day. Thank you. With that, shall we commence with Ms. Hall, please?
Good morning, sir. I'm grateful that you've got a copy of my closing submissions. I'll try and stick to my time list to it. Good morning, sir. So Infrared is the promoter of development on the nearby Eastgate estate. The council initially resolved to grant planning permission for the scheme, but failed to issue that permission, and an appeal against non-determination has now been submitted. The current appeal, an appeal by Basildon Estates Limited, and Infrared's own appeal together all raise an issue as to the acceptability of tall buildings within Basildon town centre. As such, a number of cross-cutting issues arise within the 3 appeals, which fall for determination for the first time as part of this inquiry. Infrared's evidence and submissions are focused on the inspectors, your main issue C, that is relevant planning policy in the planning balance, including housing land supply considerations, albeit that Infrared stops short of recommending an overall planning balance to you, sir. In short, our position is that regeneration of the town centre is not only desirable in a general sense, but is in line with the council's own aspirations and is desperately required in order for the council to accommodate their identified housing needs. Turning to the first issue, which is 5-year housing land supply. So as you acknowledged during the course of the inquiry, following on from the decision in Hallam Land, it is necessary to engage with the broad degree of shortfall in housing land supply in order to sensibly engage with the weight to be afforded to the benefits of providing housing, which would assist in making good that shortfall. The starting position was that the council relied exclusively on documents B14 and E1, and at the start of the inquiry, that was the only evidence addressing deliverable housing sites, and it was plain that those 2 documents provided very little, if any, clear evidence to support the council's position on supply. Midway through the inquiry, they sought to bolster their position by introducing ID 19 and ID 20, and they've now had yet a further bite at this particular cherry in their latest response dated the 1st of December 2021, in which the council now concedes to a reduced supply of 3.3 years. Infrared hasn't had a full opportunity to interrogate the council's evidence on a site-by-site basis, and we reserve the right to do that as part of our own appeal. However, at this stage, it isn't necessary for Infrared to produce their own full evidence on delivery rates or other site-specific matters in order to demonstrate that the council's supply is less than that claimed. Simply, the council's own evidence still fails to reach the required standard, and it does not support a claim that a supply is anywhere near 3.3 years. As explained in Infrared's response to ID 19 and 20, the supply is more likely to be in the region of 1.7 years. It is notable that consultants on behalf of both Rule 6 parties and the appellant have all considered the council's claim supply and found it to be wanting. The following specific points should be noted about the council's claim supply. So, and I can hear a dog barking. I really apologise if everybody else can also hear my dog barking. Hopefully somebody else will deal with it.
I think it's only distracting you rather. It's not distracting me. Let's put it that way.
I apologise. I carry on. The following specific points should be noted about the council's claim supply. Firstly, the council initially sought to bolster its position by relying on sites where permission has been granted after the base date. This isn't appropriate, particularly where the sites would not have been properly considered as deliverable at the correct date, and such sites should be removed from the supply. The council now appears to concede that point in the 1st of December document. The remaining area of dispute in relation to post-base date sites now appears to relate to Great Oaks Retail Park only, a site granted permission after the base date, but which the council still includes in the supply. In support of its inclusion, the council points towards a site being referenced in the HELAR. However, the HELAR identifies a site as suitable for employment development, and there therefore remains no good evidence to include it in the supply. Overall, the council still relies heavily on HELAR sites for their assertion that the supply is 3.3 years. HELAR sites make up around half of the supply, once town centre HELAR sites are included as well. However, HELAR sites are not allocated, do not benefit from outline or indeed any permission, and they fall outside the list of sites contemplated by the NPPF as being deliverable. And as Mr. Lowndes agreed, whilst the inspector could still go on to conclude that they're deliverable, USO would need good evidence to do so. For a range of sites, we have no clear timescales for bringing forward planning applications. The council relies heavily upon land in their own ownership and control, or that of their wholly owned subsidiary Sempra. And given the council's involvement in those sites, one assumes that evidence could easily be supplied. And in that context, its evidence is therefore striking.
Yes, do that, because I
think, Mr. Linus, your microphone is on, or one within the earshot. It certainly is.
Apologies, sir.
Yeah, okay.
I do apologise for the interruption.
Not at all. We're at point F. Sites which include or comprise of open space and those in existing or other uses, such as car parks or Wickford Health Centre, are not available now. The reliance on unexamined policies to provide a reason to ignore use as open space is not compelling. NPPF paragraph 99 provides that existing open space should not be built upon unless the particular open space is surplus. And this remains to be examined on a site-by-site basis, and such sites should therefore be removed from the supply. The PPG provides guidance as to what we should be looking for in terms of the requirement for clear evidence of completions, including A, that firm progress has been made towards the submission of an application in the form of a document, such as a written agreement with a developer, setting out delivery intentions and detail of start and build-out rates, B, firm progress with site assessment work, or C, clear, relevant information about site viability, including ownership contracts, infrastructure provision, and details of bids for funding. The tables supplied by the council contain bare assertion as to delivery, but without the detail and without actual evidence. Despite having a number of attempts at providing evidence to the inquiry, the documents still fail to include any actual evidence. Reference to agreements with landowners is made, but the agreements themselves haven't been provided. A mere assertion without a witness call to substantiate the claim or providing any documentary evidence in support isn't the sort of clear evidence anticipated by the PPG. And so, as stated by Inspector Stevens in the Little Sparrows appeal, the PPG indicates that, quote, clear evidence must be something cogent, as opposed to simply mere assertion. There must be strong evidence that a given site will in reality deliver housing in the timescale and in the numbers contended for by the party concerned. So our full response to ID 19 for the purposes of this inquiry is set out within its position statement dated 24th of November, but in short, the likely supply, we say, is nowhere near 3.3 years. Turning to the second issue that I've identified, the 2012 and 2020 master plans and town centre strategy. The 2012 master plan was conceived against a background of accommodating around 1,500 to 2,000 homes in the town centre. Even on that basis, the document envisages a consistent higher density character and to, quote, raise the overall townscape height to a new average of 4 to 7 stories. It should be noted that 4 to 7 was clearly an average rather than a cap, and Para 6.422 points towards opportunities for 10-storey buildings. And the plan on page 29 shows heights of over 12 being contemplated at that time. At a very basic level, the document envisages significant change in the town centre, an increase in density and a significant increase in height. And Michael Lowndes agreed that all three would be a feature of any future plan for the town centre. The 2020 strategy and master plan aim to accommodate 4,200 units in the town centre. Again, at a very basic level, these documents also envisage radical and significant change for the town centre, including an increase in density and in height. The 2012 SPD has been superseded by events. It aims to accommodate a housing target less than half that of more recent estimates. However, the principles to be derived from the documents are clear. The council plainly proposes an increase in density and height in the town centre, and locating housing in this location is going to be a feature of any future DPD or SPD addressing the spatial distribution of housing in Basildon. The town centre is geographically constrained, and so the natural way to accommodate the sheer number of units needed is by adding height. The only constraint on just how high is the council's view that to add extra tall buildings in this location would cause harm to Brook House and harm to the overall townscape. But given the proposals of the 2012 master plan of up to 12 stories in order to accommodate less than half the current housing requirements, it's common sense that the town centre will have to increase in height by at least this much in order to accommodate the current needs. Turning to the direction of travel, the council has made numerous public statements on delivery of housing, both as part of their action plans and to the EIP, that town centre regeneration will form an important component of meeting housing needs. The 2020 action plan places reliance upon an update to the town centre master plan and an updated capacity study. Given the context of the action plan is how the council can boost supply, this can only sensibly be interpreted as an assertion that the town centre capacity is likely to increase from existing, that is, above 4,200. The 2021 action plan carries forward the same theme, and again sees the council relying on an updated capacity study, albeit this time expressly with the aim of, quote, identifying additional urban supply for housing. Again, this is confirmation that the council sees the town centre as needing to accommodate in excess of 4,200 units in the future, i.e. far more than double the number proposed at the time of the 2012 master plan. In terms of the weight to be afforded to statements in the action plan, it's notable that the council places heavy reliance on this document in its 1st of December position statement to justify the inclusion of sites in the 5-year supply. Numerous references are made to having a clear commitment to sites simply because they're referred to in the action plan. Accordingly, if it's appropriate to hold the council to its promises in the action for one purpose, it should be appropriate to hold them to its promises for another. And significant weight may attach to the council's intention to find additional supply in the town centre over and above the 4,200 already stated to the EIP. Accordingly, when the council states, as it does in ID 20, that the 2020 strategy and the number of 4,200 cannot be relied upon because, quote, the council is considering further the matter of capacity within the town centre, whilst the implication from the council of that statement is that it's because of townscape constraints, That's not the right inference to draw in light of the clear statements in the action plans that town centre capacity is due to increase rather than decrease. Any revision of the 2020 strategy needs to make the same drivers, increased housing need from 2012 and satisfy the 2020 and 2021 action plans, increase the number of dwellings delivered in the town centre, safeguard greenbelt release and accommodate 5-year supply shortfall, plus needs which are accruing all the time at a rate of around 1,000 dwellings a year. Those pressures for increased housing in the town centre haven't gone away, and any new strategy will need to meet all of those needs. In any event, as ML conceded, it is no part of the council's case that the appellant or appellants should be asked to wait for a new strategy. The decision facing you, sir, is one absent any policy constraint on increasing height, increasing density, or increasing number of units in the town centre. However, sir, what is clear is that in reality, the council needs to do all three. Turning to height specifically, Mr. Lowndes' threshold is that any new building needs to be, quote, substantially lower than Brook House. That assessment doesn't take into account whether this can be achieved whilst at the same time meeting Basildon's chronic housing undersupply or rapidly accruing future needs. Mr. Lowndes also conceded that his assessment was not based upon any viability assessment of lower heights. Instead, he presented what was essentially a pure townscape argument rather than a balanced planning judgment. Should the inspector find any townscape harm, so this is merely one factor for you to weigh into the overall balance. And as Mr. Mumby stated in his oral evidence, the NPPF needs to be read and applied as a whole, rather than seeking to focus, as the council has done, on one aim of the NPPF. Yes, the NPPF seeks good design, but it also seeks to significantly boost housing supply, to encourage reuse of brownfield sites, and to encourage major development in sustainable locations, such as the town centre. Height was said to be constrained by the existing new town design of the town centre and its overriding horizontality. However, the National Design Guide is clear that good design isn't stasis. Good design enhances the positive qualities and improves negative ones. Currently, the town centre is not working. It does not provide a vibrant retail core and does not provide sufficient housing to meet Basildon's needs. Paragraph 41 of the design guide is clear that these economic and social motives are legitimate inputs into consideration of what a well-designed place needs to achieve. And further, paragraph 44 is clear that good design needs to be fit for purpose today. The existing form and height of the town centre, encircled as it is by car parks and large ring road with few permanent occupants, isn't fit for purpose today. In order to modernise the town centre and make it fit for purpose, all parties are agreed that the centre would benefit from an increased density and height. The question is merely, how high is okay? This will be addressed in detail in infrared zone inquiry, but for the purposes of this appeal, we merely note that it's essentially a matter, sir, of judgment for you, to be taken in the context of the chronic need to modernise the town centre and to accommodate further residential units. Finally, in conclusion, the submissions set out within our openings remain good. The claimed housing supply is woeful, but it's still a significant overestimate. The true position is likely to be as low as 1.7 years. The need for housing is chronic. Even on the 2012 master plan, which sought to achieve less than half the current target, the council's plan was to increase height to over 12 stories in places and to increase density and height overall. The 2020 strategy took that further, seeking to accommodate 4,200 units. That too is now likely to be superseded by an even higher target, which simply cannot be accommodated without increase in height. The town centre is a sustainable location, involves the reuse of brownfield land and avoids extensive greenbelt release. So development of this nature and scale of that proposed is an inevitable, necessary, and moreover, we say desirable part of Basildon's future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Hall. Can I now move on to Mr. Hill, please?
Thank you very much, sir. Can I just check that you and everyone can hear me?
I can hear you clearly. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, sir. I have sent the version that I hope you will have reached via Mr. Salter this morning to Ms. Hall, Mr. Edwards, and Mr. Linus, and I hope they've received that so they wouldn't have to take notes.
I've certainly received it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. With some apologies in advance for any familiar themes from what you just heard from Ms. Hall. We haven't shared notes in advance, so there is a degree of overlap, but as you know, I'm only going to be 20 minutes. So may I begin by thanking you for permitting our participation at this inquiry, the rationale for which I explained in my short opening on day one, to which I refer you without repeating it here. I hope you will agree that the involvement of my clients has been proportionate and that we've not sought to exceed the limited terms upon which I explained BEL's interests in this case. It seems to me, sir, just by way of some opening observations, that this appeal is a paradigm of the classic town planning exercise of attributing weight carefully to a range of issues and considerations, and then ensuring that these are balanced appropriately. And in this case, we're at a considerable advantage in that all parties agree that the tilted balance is engaged, such that planning permission should be granted unless any adverse impacts of doing so would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. However, in this case, the Council has simply not carried out the weighing and balancing exercise correctly. Indeed, the evidence to the inquiry, the Council's evidence to the inquiry, gives only derisory consideration to the enormity of the problems which Basildon faces in respect of the regeneration of its town centre, and just as importantly, its chronic inability to deliver the housing needed to meet its acute needs, manifest by a woefully inadequate 5-year housing land supply and a dismal housing delivery test performance. These latter points attract only the briefest mention by Mr. Lowndes, who told me in cross-examination that he was not instructed to do more than make a general reference to these issues. Inevitably, this means that the Council's case at this inquiry has been skewed disproportionately towards its townscape concerns and has failed, in our view, to grapple effectively or at all with the enormous housing and regeneration challenge facing Basildon. We have recognised from the outset that BEL does not present a complete case on the appeal proposals, as it's chosen not to address the detailed design and arrangement of the appeal scheme. However, the determination of this appeal will require conclusions to be reached on matters which are directly relevant to both the BEL and infrared appeals, relevant both as to underlying findings of fact and as to the weight to be attached to those matters in the planning balance, whether or not they prove to be determinative in this appeal. And I turn now, or return, I should say, to the themes which I set out in my short opening submissions. I won't read out the list of points 1 to 3, sir, because they then form the headings for the next 3 sections. And the first is the need for the physical and functional regeneration of Basildon Town Centre, BTC, hereafter. We do not seriously believe that this can be in doubt, sir. The scale of the task is self-evident from any walk around the town. Buildings are decaying, many are vacant. The fabric of the town centre is in urgent need of renewal. Moreover, Basildon Town Centre urgently needs reinventing. It's difficult to see how those interminable 1960s retail parades will ever be reoccupied for their original purpose, a problem compounded by the explosion in online retailing, subsequently fueled by the pandemic. The Council has been planning this regeneration in public documents for a decade, but has achieved very little to date as a proportion of what requires now to be done. It is submitted that the solution must lie in large-scale private sector investment in the town centre to deliver the dramatic renewal required. And this needs to be in the form of viable redevelopment proposals, which will need to be residential-led mixed-use proposals with the critical mass necessary to attract investment and guarantee delivery. It is inevitable that this will bring about a major change to the appearance of Basildon Town Centre. But that cannot and should not be looked upon as a negative outcome. It must surely be grasped as a positive outcome, a physical and functional manifestation of renewal. As Mr. Lyons agreed with me in cross-examination, Basildon Town Centre, covering 65 acres, is remarkable in that it has so few designated heritage assets for such an extensive area. Other than the Brook House cluster, there are no listed buildings, no locally listed buildings, no scheduled ancient monuments, no conservation areas. This offers an extraordinary opportunity for renewal. As I've already mentioned, the Council has consistently supported renewal and regeneration in the town centre and had recently published a town centre regeneration strategy and master plan, which was both informed by extensive external consultant input and subject to a full round of public consultation. This work stream had been progressing in parallel with the 3 applications now subject to appeal and was broadly supportive of them. It is only the election of a new political administration that has caused an attempt to be made to cast aside the fruits of this work. BEL is firmly of the view that this exercise remains material and should attract weight, and that the mere fact of a newly elected cohort of politicians no longer wishes to support a strategy does not at a stroke negate the research, deliberation, consultation, all undertaken at considerable public expense, which underpins the document as published. It's that underlying evidence base which remains material and cannot be rendered void simply by a change of political direction. In my submission, it's also noteworthy that the evidential support for the Council's volte-face has been provided by a witness who had no previous professional involvement in Basildon and was only instructed to act for the Council a matter of weeks before proofs of evidence were due. By contrast, Ms. Markham, who gave evidence of BEL, is closely acquainted with Basildon Town Centre, and her practice Montague Evans have been considering and responding to the townscape issues which arise at Basildon, alongside professional officers who support the current Orwell's appeal scheme for a lengthy period of time. And it's submitted that this factor, that depth of experience and knowledge, should affect the weight which you attach to the Council's townscape evidence of this inquiry. And I turn to my second proposition, the capacity and need for Basildon Town Centre to accommodate new and taller buildings. I turn now to consider more specifically the role of new and taller buildings within a reinvented and reinvigorated town centre. This issue arises because the Council has now decided, that it objects to the Orwell scheme in part on the basis that it is necessary to preserve the singularity of Brook House as a tall building within the town centre. At the same time, the Council has confirmed that it has no heritage-based objection to the appeal scheme and that it does not suggest that the appeal scheme, rising to 17 stories, would give rise to a harmful heritage impact. In my submission, the proposition that nothing must challenge the supposed landmark role of Brook House in Basildon Town Centre is entirely devoid of merit and a completely unsound basis upon which to advance a case for the following reasons. First, Brook House does not, as a matter of fact, appear as a singular tall building in the town centre. Great Oaks House undoubtedly has a similar presence as a taller building, very much within the same urban block as Brook House. Likewise, other taller buildings occur just beyond the ring road, but adjoining the railway station and within the adopted town centre boundary. The contrary suggestion can only be based upon myopia. And I refer you back to those aerial photographs and of course your own experience walking around at the town centre now on a number of occasions. But in any event, sir, there is no policy basis for seeking to preserve the status quo in terms of the skyline of Basildon Town Centre. In particular, there is no national or local policy enforced to achieve this end. As noted above, heritage impact is not cited as a putative reason for refusal, and Mr. Lyons agreed that there's no SPD in place setting up a presumption against new tall buildings in the town centre, although of course the Council has had decades in which to pursue such a policy approach had it wished to do so. There is no evidence that Brook House was intended by the Newtown master planners of Basildon to be the only tall or the tallest building in Basildon town centre. Indeed, contemporary articles suggest that there was a real hope for much greater height in the town centre, but this was frustrated by considerations of cost and viability. The praise lavished upon Brook House when it was completed as a hugely welcome vertical contrast to the American mall-inspired horizontality of most of the town centre would plainly apply in principle elsewhere in the 65-acre town centre. But sir, even if there were evidence from the 1950s or 60s that Brook House was originally intended to be a singular landmark, which there is not, on what possible basis could Basildon town centre claim to be immune from evolving requirements for new development, which have affected urban skylines and streetscapes across the country over the past 50 years, and where a settlement's original tallest buildings have long been eclipsed in height? I refer you in my footnote 6 the most obvious example of St. Paul's Cathedral, which used to tower over the city of London. But of course, every urban centre of scale has similar examples. Insofar as Brook House plays a role as a marker for the town centre, which Mr. Lands expressly agreed was his case, Mr. Lands also expressly agreed with me in cross-examination that there is no reason why a cluster of tall buildings could not act to mark a town centre just as effectively as a singular tall building. And he also agreed that many other towns and cities have many more than a singleton tall building marking their centres. Mr. Lowndes also agreed that there was no evidence that anyone had previously, i.e. prior to the 3 current appeal proposals, come forward with a viable proposal to build anything in the town centre taller than Brook House. So it remained and remains effectively by default the tallest building to date in Basildon town centre. Again, this is no reason to turn away a proposal such as the appeal proposals or those which follow it, especially where there's a powerful positive case, positive planning case as supporting such a proposal. Finally, sir, under this head, Brook House has such a muscular presence and is so obviously a product of the 1960s that it will always be readily identifiable for what it is, a brutalist tower block of the post-war era. Mr. Lowndes tried to suggest that this muscular architectural presence was in some undefined way fragile or in danger of being compromised. However, so long as its form can be separately discerned from other buildings in the town centre as one walks or moves about the town centre, then it is, in my submission, very difficult indeed to see how its appreciation could be materially diminished. And of course, there is some irony here, as it's the council itself which has been authorising the demolition of listed and other contemporary structures at the foot of Brook House and their replacement with an overtly modern cinema complex, thereby destroying its original context and setting as experienced by the pedestrian and in the face of vocal opposition from the 20th century society. In summary, sir, under this head, whilst there will be change, there will be no materially harmful impacts associated with building other taller structures within the town centre. On the contrary, there's a positive case for building more taller vertical structures in the town centre, especially as this is the typology which is directly associated with the provision of significant quanta of residential accommodation in urban areas. And I return to that theme now in my third proposition. The case for delivering major residential-led mixed-use development at the heart of Basildon Borough in its town centre. Not only is there a sound design and townscape rationale for introducing further taller buildings into the town centre, there is a clear imperative to do so in order to deliver the quantum of housing which Basildon so urgently and desperately needs in a highly sustainable location. The overarching numeric position, which Ms. Hall has already reviewed, has been in flux since the council chose to publish new 5-year housing land supply data in the run-up to the inquiry, and since when it has steadily sought to augment the material upon which it relies, right up to Wednesday of this week, where there was a further lengthy augmentation, which we're not able to interrogate, so, and I don't ask that we should, but to which BEL will respond in the context of its own forthcoming public inquiry. The Council's current position, as you will have seen from that Wednesday note, now appears to be that it has a 3.3-year 5-year housing land supply, coming down from the 3.5. But of course, as I explored with Mr. Lyons, one needs to look beyond the deficit expressed in years to examine the actual units of housing which need to be delivered in a given local authority area in order to deliver a 5-year housing land supply. The actual or absolute number will vary enormously across the country, depending upon the annual requirement figure of the local authority in question. Basildon's annual requirement is substantial, 1,210 units per annum. Accordingly, on the Council's own case, it is over 2,000 units short of securing a 5-year housing land supply. BEL, and indeed Infrared, consider this to be a serious underestimate and puts the real supply figure at about 1.7 years, meaning that there is 3.3 years supply still to find, or nearly 4,000 units. But the missing numbers, be they 2,000 or 4,000 or something in between, requiring to be secured as part of Basildon's housing supply in the current 5-year period, represent a very serious shortfall. So, Mr. Lyons accepted in cross-examination, even on the basis of the Council's figures, that you must attach very substantial weight to a shortfall on this scale. As I noted in my short opening, it's important to approach this issue properly, and I know you're very well aware of this, as the Court of Appeal has ruled that the quantum of a 5-year housing land supply deficit should be assessed by a decision maker when the tilted balance is being weighed, so that the scale of a 5-year housing land supply deficit is important, not merely the existence of one. However, sir, the decision maker must also attach weight to the ability of the Council rapidly to rectify the deficit. And here, it is clear that the Council has very few options open to it in the short term, significantly to boost its housing land supply. The Council has already counted in a large number of schemes where RPS and ICNI, on behalf of Infrared, consider reliable evidence of deliverability to be absent. Miss Hall has run through some of those already. I refer you to our note of last Wednesday's date. After exhausting its urban options, we know that the Council has to turn to Greenbelt release to fulfill its requirements in circumstances where it has already set out a public position that it cannot meet its own housing needs due to constraints, and where the local plan process, which would need to authorize Greenbelt release, has badly stalled. It's axiomatic, so, and you'll know this from your long experience, that strategic sites carved out of the adopted Greenbelt and requiring extensive supporting infrastructure are hugely controversial, take many years to plan and deliver, and are simply not a credible means of addressing Basildon's immediate and urgent housing crisis, manifest by its very poor 5-year housing land supply and HDT performance. Another factor which must surely weigh very heavily in the balance in relation to large-scale residential-led mixed-use schemes in Basildon Town Centre is their uniquely sustainable location in the borough. The consequences in terms of sustainable development are dramatic. The absence of motor vehicle-led transport solutions, almost inevitable in a Greenbelt location. The extraordinarily good linkages to places of work, shopping, leisure, education, and all other facilities, which will in turn be sustained and enhanced by the presence on their doorsteps of a large new residential population, which Basildon Town Centre has lacked for so long. It is, sir, a virtual circle. These factors must all be loaded into the tilted balance when a decision maker is undertaking the weighing exercise, and must, in my submission, weigh very heavily indeed in that balance, especially when the absence of sustainable alternative means to address the thousands of units missing from Basildon's 5-year housing land supply is considered. So briefly, sir, my conclusions are, whilst recognising that BEL has not addressed all the matters which arise in this appeal, we consider that there is powerful evidence before this inquiry to support findings as part of your decision letter on the following matters. First, the urgent need to drive forward the physical and functional regeneration and reinvention of Basildon Town Centre. Third, the need and capacity for a substantial mass of new development within the town centre, including new tall buildings, without historically inaccurate, unwarranted and unjustifiable deference to Brook House. And third, the absolute imperative upon the council to maximise its opportunities to provide for its acknowledged and urgent development needs on uniquely sustainable brownfield town centre sites, especially in the light of a stalled local plan, failure to achieve a 5-year housing land supply short by 2,000 to 4,000 units, and dismal HDT performance. And, sir, when the alternative to doing so is far less sustainable and extremely protracted greenbelt release. Thank you, sir. Those are my submissions. Unless there's anything further I can assist you with.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Thank you. Mr. Edwards, if we can turn to you now, please, for your closings on behalf of the council, and on the basis of the time estimate, then I think we will take the mid-morning break once I've heard your closings. Mr. Edwards, please.
Thank you very much indeed, sir. You have a copy of our closing submissions reduced into writing, as I hope do cancel for the other parties.
Thank you.
In our opening statement, we began by setting out what did not appear to be an issue between the principal parties to the appeal. And to frame these closing submissions, we set out again those matters, and they are these. Firstly, the council does not oppose the principle of residential-led mixed-use development of the appeal site. It does not oppose the demolition of what is presently built on the site, subject to endeavours being made to incorporate the mural on the northern elevation into a new development. 2, the council supports appropriate regenerative development within Basildon Town Centre and welcomes the range of benefits that, as an outcome, suitable regeneration can be expected to deliver. Thirdly, the council recognises that housing supply and delivery in Basildon is constrained, and as such, the contribution to housing supply, which the appeal proposal offers, is a significant consideration in its favour. 4, the council cannot demonstrate a 5-year supply of deliverable sites for housing. The council's position is that, as at the base date of the 1st of April 2021, it could demonstrate 3.5 years of supply. As such, and for the purposes of paragraph 11D of the framework, the development plan policies which are most important in the context of this appeal are out of date, and the tilted balance is engaged. And fifthly, for the council to prevail at this appeal, any adverse effects of granting planning permission must be shown to significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. The council's objection to the proposal was and remains in respect of the impact of what is proposed on the character and appearance of Basildon Town Centre, as well as the poor quality of the amenity to be offered to future residents of the scheme. And in these closing submissions, we address each of those 2 objections in turn, and we do so by reference to the main issues, sir, that you have identified. And the first of those main issues is, having regard to the government's objective of achieving well-designed places, the effect of the proposal on the character and appearance of the area. It appears to be common ground, as between the appellant and the council at least, that in order to properly assess the impact of a proposal on townscape, there needs to be a clear appreciation of the character and quality of that townscape. Indeed, an understanding of these matters on the part of the scheme designer at the outset of the commission is fundamental to achieving a successful design, and we'll return to this matter shortly. So far as the existing character of the surrounding area is concerned, there is much by way of agreement as between the principal parties. And in this respect, we make the following points. Firstly, the history of the evolution of Basildon Town Centre as a new town is well rehearsed in the evidence of Mr. Lowndes, as well as that of Mr. Cafferty and Miss Markham. That history does not need to be repeated. However, what is common ground is that the town centre continues to display a character consistent with the original concept, which informed its layout and design. And Mr. Cafferty agreed with this proposition in cross-examination, and this is common ground. Secondly, the appellant and the council at least agree that much of the existing fabric is relatively low scale. Miss Markham, in her written evidence, confirms that the town is characterised by buildings of 2 to 4 stories with large footprints, and we agree, and so it seems does Mr. Cafferty. It is plainly correct as a statement, and Miss Markham's attempt to refine in oral evidence this assessment should be disregarded, not least since it's wrong. Thirdly, the parties seem to accept that Brook House is and performs the function of a landmark building within the town centre, and was intended as such as part of the original design concept. The appellant's own assessment that Brook House was intended as the building to define Basildon and act very much like a church spire insofar as it is a waymarker pointing out the location of the town centre cannot be improved upon. The appellant accepts that there is much to be taken from the undoubted qualities that represent the essence of Basildon's modernist architecture, and we agree, and the extent to which the appellant has taken this opportunity is a matter to which we will return. For the avoidance of doubt, we do not accept, as the appellant suggests, that the quality and importance of Basildon is in some way limited to and is derived from its spatial layout, that is, the linked spaces and squares. Built form is, we submit, of equal or even greater importance in establishing the current sense of place, as Mr. Lowndes explained in evidence. Fifthly, the current development on the appeal site in terms of built form remains as it was at the time of implementation of the original concept for the town centre and accords with the original concept master plan. The development was one of the first elements of the original master plan to have been built and is part of the original comprehensive scheme for Basildon. And it's noteworthy that Pevsner observes that the original proportion of the town centre is remarkably well preserved, and the appeal site contributes to this, we submit. This is not to suggest that the current development on the appeal site must be retained, but this context should inform the built form of that which replaces it. And again, we'll return to this shortly. It is also common ground, unsurprisingly, that the existing character and appearance of the town centre provides the context against which the impact of the proposals must be assessed. We return to policy in more detail later in these submissions. However, the government is clear that new development is required to be sympathetic to local character and history and establish or maintain a strong sense of place. And it's important not to lose sight of this policy touchstone. So the detail of what is proposed will be familiar to you. We do, however, highlight a few components. The development will be 17 stories above ground at its highest point in the northwest corner. At that point, it will be 56.45 metres and thus will be taller than Brook House, which it is agreed is 46 odd metres at the top of its 14th story and 50.16 metres was when account is taken of the roof enclosure. What is proposed will therefore become the tallest building in the town centre. It will be in the order of 6 metres taller than Brook House, the intended and actual landmark building within Basildon Town Centre. We turn then to impact. The council objects to this scheme by reason of its height, scale, massing and general design, which is unacceptably harmful to the townscape, including to the landmark function of Brook House. Mr. Lowndes explained the basis of the council's concerns, and we do not repeat this evidence in closing submissions. However, we do submit that Mr. Lowndes' evidence was carefully considered and measured, and we suggest withstood admirably the scrutiny of cross-examination. This evidence and the judgments which underlie it should be given very considerable weight in the assessment of impacts. Put shortly and in brief summary, the built form of what is proposed exceeds by large measure any existing or envisaged built development in the town centre, including in terms of height, Brook House. The current arrangement of built form, low-rise, 2 to 4 stories, with Brook House as the landmark building, will be substantially disrupted by the proposal. And there is, of course, nothing in the original concept for Basildon Town Centre which envisaged or lends support to an intervention such as the appellant proposes. Indeed, the appellant's CGIs demonstrate the harm, and we refer you in particular, sir, to viewpoint 12 and viewpoint 15, produced as part of the environmental statement. We address at this stage certain particular aspects of impact of the proposal. First, there is impact on Brook House and its function in contributing to the character and appearance of the townscape. And we make the following points. It is common ground, we think, that Brook House was intended to and continues to perform a landmark function within the town centre of Basildon. Indeed, any suggestion to the contrary might be thought to be untenable. Secondly, the importance of Brook House is encapsulated well by the appellant in some of its evidence. So we've referred already in these submissions to Mr. Harris's Appendix 1 and the assessment made by Mr. Griffiths of HC UK, the appellant's heritage consultant. And the appellant's case is this. Brook House was the only tall building to form part of the new town plan and was designed to stand out from its surroundings. Brook House was designed with the intention of being a high status building and an architectural landmark that demonstrated innovation, and a new way of living. At 160 feet in height, it provided a much needed focal point and visual accent in an otherwise low-rise development. It is entirely urban in its appearance and purpose, intended as the building to define Basildon and act very much like a church spire insofar as it is a waymarker in the tradition of Stadkrone, pointing out the location of the town centre. The appellant says that there is no denying the powerful presence of Brook House in relation to Town Square and East Square, which it was designed to dominate, complement and captivate. In view of the low-rise character of the existing buildings around Town Square in particular, this dominating effect remains intact. The appellant also says that in summary, Brook House is very much a focus for the town centre, historically acting as a waymarker and by far the most prominent and visible feature associated with the original development. There are small numbers of other tall buildings close by, but Brook House is easily the most prominent at 14 stories above the very tall base, being the equivalent of a 16-story residential tower. And finally, the appellant says that the site in its current form contributes positively to the building's setting by virtue of its contemporary character and low stature to Town Square. It serves to accentuate the height and primacy of Brook House as the centrepiece of Basildon Town Centre, as originally conceived and executed. And the appellant in its design and access statement makes similar observations to those of Mr. Griffiths. At page 114 of the DAS, the appellant describes Brook House as a strong identity marker for the town. And Mr. Jackson, again for the appellant in his proof of evidence, states that in townscape terms, Brook House remains a local landmark and a recognisable building within the town centre, particularly in terms of its more immediate role and influence within the central part of the town around East Square and Town Square. We have already noted that the appeal proposal at its highest point will be taller than Brook House by some 6 metres. And this increase in height will be experienced in the context of a building of substantial scale and overall form. The council's case is that the effect of the proposal as a result of height and overall built form will be incongruous and damaging to the existing character of the townscape and will erode the intended and current landmark function, the powerful presence and dominance, as the appellant describes it, of Brook House as an element of that townscape. And it is notable that the appellant's own assessment is not vastly different. The appellant accepts that the proposed development would cause Brook House's preeminence and landmark quality to be eroded, and that Brook House would no longer be the singular iconic tall building within the new town centre. We agree. And given the important contribution of Brook House in establishing and maintaining townscape character, it cannot be claimed sensibly that the appeal proposal is sympathetic to local character or that it maintains a strong sense of place, as national policy requires. Indeed, Mr. Cafferty's evidence was revealing, particularly his statement that Brook House as a landmark building was in the wrong place, and essentially that the centre of gravity now needed to be near or en routes from the station. However, Brook House is where it is, and it performs the function that it does in terms of contributing to townscape character. Mr. Cafferty may well have designed the town centre differently if he'd been given the opportunity, but he has not. And the impact of the proposal must be judged by reference to existing character, not by reference to what Mr. Cafferty and the appellant might wish that character to now be, or now to be, so there's a surplus to there. Before we move on to other impacts, we address 4 discrete points concerning the appellant's case with regard to impact on Brook House as an element of the townscape. And these are these. Firstly, the appellant, when confronted with its own assessment within Mr. Griffiths' heritage statement, sought in re-examination of Mr. Cafferty to suggest that the harm to Brook House identified by Mr. Griffiths was limited to long-range views. That is not the case. In terms of townscape function, so much is clear from paragraphs 217, 220 and 223 of that assessment, and Mr. Jackson in his proof at paragraph 6.61 confirms this, and we've referred to those matters in earlier paragraphs of these submissions, sir. Secondly, the appellant also suggests that the singularity of Brook House has been eroded by more recently approved taller buildings. So you will have noted that Mr. Cafferty stated in examination in chief that, in respect of Brook House, singularity did exist, but has been eroded. We disagree. And in that respect, we note that the appellant, through its DAS and through Mr. Griffiths' statement, made clear that the landmark quality of Brook House is still experienced, as indeed it is. Moreover, and with regard to more recently approved taller buildings, the appellant's evidence is that these buildings, including Great Oaks House, the Icon, Trafford House, and the recently approved GS8 development, are in peripheral or transitional locations, as Mr. Harris states in his proof of evidence. These are not such as to erode the singularity or landmark quality and contribution of Brook House, as confirmed in Mr. Harris's Appendix 1, paragraph 2.20. And in the context of that evidence, it is now not open to the appellant to argue to the contrary. Thirdly, there has been some discussion as to whether the original concept for Basildon Town Centre, that within the original concept for Basildon Town Centre, Brook House was envisaged to be a single tall building or the first of several. The historic evidence which is before the inquiry is not determinative, but there is certainly nothing to suggest that Brook House was a pioneer with other similarly scaled buildings to follow. And the extract from the architectural review produced by Miss Markham conspicuously refers to the concept as being to introduce a tall building expressed in the singular. Interesting as this debate may be, it does not, we suggest, much matter, given that all main parties now seem to agree that Brook House performs a landmark function contributing to the character of the town centre, and an important one at that. Fourthly, the appellant places some reliance on the Quality Review Panel response to the 20th of May 2020. In terms of the acceptability of the height of any scheme, the QRP was clear and explicit that a further review of appropriate building heights and placement within the town centre is now required to ensure that both existing key views are not harmfully affected. And the panel also expressed some concerns about the lack of relevance and connections to the existing character of Basildon. The appellant cannot, we submit, take much by way of support from this response. And as we will submit shortly, the absence of any explanation as to why the scheme is advanced as it is, and the absence of any further engagement with the QRP, leave their concerns and reservations unresolved. We turn then to other particular impacts on the town centre. First, there is St Martin's Square, to which the northern and western elements of the development, including its tallest part, will most closely relate. We make the obvious point that the proposals will introduce a built form which, in terms of height, scale and massing, has no precedent in terms of the existing character or form of St Martin's Square, or any grounding within the original concept master plan for that part of the town centre. What is proposed will be substantially and significantly of greater scale than any other building enclosing the square, and, put shortly, will overwhelm the space and the experience of those using it. The appellant has not produced, for the purposes of this appeal, any CGI that shows a true impression of the proposal from within the square. However, viewpoint 12 within the ES, taken from north of St Martin's Square on the north side of Broadmain, is perhaps to some extent informative of the general relationship in terms of scale of that which is proposed with the public space. The artist impression at page 2 of Mr. Cafferty's presentation needs to be approached with caution, but taken at its face value, it demonstrates what the council considers to be an unsatisfactory relationship in scale, its height and scale. The appellant says that the appeal scheme will remedy what it sees as deficiencies in the composition, function and experience of and from within St Martin's Square. The appellant says that the space requires better enclosure, the introduction of a key urban marker and improved wayfinding, and improved animation and uses. The appellant also says increased scale is required in this southeast corner of the square. To the extent to which these are true deficiencies, we'll return to below. However, even if they are, then none demands a response in the form of a building of substantial scale and of 17 stories in height, generating the adverse effects that this proposal does. And Mr. Cafferty accepted in cross-examination that a landmark building and improved wayfinding, if these are required, do not demand the height proposed. Moreover, the enclosure of the square and increased street level activity equally do not require the form of development proposed and can logically be expected to be delivered by any form of redevelopment on the appeal site. In any event, it is notable that none of the urban design assessments of the town centre acknowledge the need for a response in the form of the appeal proposal to deliver qualitative improvements to St Martin's Square. The Council's 2012 Town Centre Master Plan sets out a vision for St Martin's Square, but without suggesting an intervention of the scale and height proposed. The master plan does say that taller buildings along Fodderwick would benefit the legibility of the town centre if placed strategically at key arrival points and on routes to the town centre. However, on the very next page of the master plan, increased height on the western part of the appeal site is indicated to be to 2 to 4 stories. The master plan does not support the appellant's approach, therefore. The appellant has had to resort to suggesting that there is an internal inconsistency within the master. Sorry, forgive me, I'll start that sentence again. That the appellant has had to resort to suggesting there is an inconsistency within the master plan is unworthy as a response and should be discounted. And although it is the case that development needs may have changed, in terms of urban design considerations, there is no reason to conclude that what is set out within the master plan of 2012 does not still hold good. We made that assessment in the same way does not suggest a building of the scale proposed on the appeal site as a response to the current form and opportunities in St Martin's Square. Indeed, at page 50, it identifies the bell tower as a very distinctive landmark and as being prominent in the townscape. And the appeal proposal, we suggest, will hardly respect this. Thus, we say, from the north and west, the appeal proposal in terms of built form will have an unacceptably harmful effect on townscape character and appearance. From the east, within Town Square, and when seen from East Walk, and from the south, approaching from Basildon Station, the appeal proposal will, through its built form, and in particular its height and overall scale, be unsympathetic in townscape terms. And from these locations, the dilution of the importance of Brook House will be experienced in particular. We do not repeat submissions already made in that respect. In terms of legibility and wayfinding, the approach from the south, when approaching from the south, there is plainly no requirement for the increase in height proposed to achieve as an outcome as accepted, as Mr. Cafferty accepted. In terms of detailed design, the concerns of the Council have been explained in evidence by Mr. Lowndes and Mr. Dealey. We do not repeat that evidence in full. Amongst those concerns is the predominant vertical emphasis within the elevations. The Council submits that the appellant has not properly recognised, considered and addressed the horizontality which is so clearly displayed within the existing townscape and which has highly successfully been incorporated into Brook House. The appeal proposal, which aspires to reflect and respect Brook House in terms of the balance of verticality of form with horizontality in detailed design, is unsuccessful, as Mr. Lowndes demonstrated. Furthermore, the predominance of brick within the palette has no reliable or positive precedent within the town, in the town centre's original design or concept. And in this respect, the concerns of the quality review panel are revealing. The panel expressed the concern that the use of brick to the extent proposed generated a risk of losing character to what could be seen as a more London identity. And looked at as a whole, and as Mr. Lowndes described rightly, this is any place design, and not thus a design which respects or reflects the existing strong sense of place present in Basildon Town Centre. These concerns, and others expressed by Mr. Lowndes and Mr. Dealey, compound the harm we submit. How it is that the appellant arrived at this scheme, to the extent that this is discernible from the evidence presented, is informative. It is notable that the inquiry has not been given the opportunity to hear evidence from the scheme architect, Mr. Matt Ward of Swap. Mr. Ward has produced no written or other evidence whatsoever in response to the Council's objections to the grant of planning permission or in support of this appeal. His instructions have not been provided, and thus what quantum of development he was required to deliver, if any, has not been revealed. Indeed, the inquiry has heard from Mr. Cafferty, who acknowledged that he was not involved in the scheme evolution. And this omission is surprising, unconventional, and unsatisfactory. The evidence given to the inquiry concerning the decisions taken in the evolution of the scheme and the reasons why the proposal has been advanced as it is all second-hand. Mr. Cafferty offered some unavoidably indirect explanation of the evolution of the scheme at pre-application stage by reference principally to the DAS. What is readily apparent is that from the first pre-application engagement, the appellant was at all times seeking to introduce a substantial increase in height within the appeal site. And as Mr. Cafferty confirmed, at no time in the process of pre-application engagement with the appellant did the appellant present or advance a scheme of less than 17 stories in height. Mr. Cafferty stated in his oral evidence that SWAP considered the capacity to accommodate change, considered form, but also the policy required to optimize brownfield sites. They started with a more traditional form, modeled it, cut and carved, pushed and pulled it apart. That is all very interesting, but no explanation of this process, nor of the decisions taken and why, is offered in written form or through the scheme's architect. Indeed, how the appellant arrived at the scheme in the form and height proposed is wholly unexplained. Mr. Cafferty's reference to the initial design options of the DAS pages 76 to 77 do not assist, not least since the pros and cons of each are not set out. This is a matter of some importance, we submit. An understanding of why the decision was taken to advance a built form as proposed, particularly given the very substantial departure from the current composition of the town centre, is, we suggest, relevant in determining its acceptability. An explanation from the appellant to meaningfully contribute to such an understanding is reasonably to have been expected, and it is notable and regrettable that this has not been forthcoming. In conclusion, therefore, what is proposed here is, we submit, harmful to the surrounding area, contrary to SAVE policy BE12, and it is also a scheme which fails to comply with the framework of paragraph 130 at all levels, in that first, it fails to function well and add to the overall quality of the area. It is not visually attractive as a result of good architecture. It is not sympathetic to local character, including the surrounding built environment. It fails to establish and maintain a strong sense of place, and fails to optimize the potential of the site to accommodate an appropriate amount and mix of development. While rather, we say, it introduces an inappropriate amount of development delivered in an inappropriate built form. The scheme also fails to meet the objective of securing a well-designed place in accordance with the framework of paragraph 134. And the related parts of the National Design Guide, which place emphasis on well-designed new development, which responds positively to the surrounding context, and which is integrated into its wider surroundings physically, socially, and visually, are not observed here. Finally, there is the Basildon Town Centre Regeneration Strategy of 2020 and the draft master plan. There's been some debate as to the extent to which either attract any weight in the determination of this appeal. The Council considers firmly that neither attracts any such weight, and some degree of consensus has emerged in this respect. Mr. Mumby for Infrared was clear as to his position, and Mr. Mumby stated that the Basildon Town Centre Regeneration Strategy 2020 does not hold any weight within the decision-making process and has no formal policy status. We agree. Similarly, Mr. Harris for the appellant confirms that the regeneration strategy has no formal policy status or formal weight. With regard to the concept of informal weight, whatsoever that may mean, so you've been informed that the Council will not be advancing the draft master plan further, and that the regeneration strategy, which was not the responsibility of the planning department of the Council, is no longer being pursued. The Council has commissioned a further assessment of urban capacity to be published later this month, which will inform further suggested modifications to the strategy and policies of the emerging local plan, and will form part of the evidence base for the examination of that draft plan. Given that neither document is to be taken forward by the Council, neither attracts any weight. So we turn then a little more briefly to main issue 2, whether the proposal would provide acceptable living conditions for future occupants. The policy context for consideration of the second main issue is straightforward and ought not to be controversial. It is sufficient to refer to the framework of paragraph 130 subparagraph F, which requires new development to create places that are, amongst other things, inclusive and accessible, and which promote health and well-being with a high standard of amenity for existing and future users. The Council's concern is focused on two matters. Firstly, access to amenity space, and secondly, accessibility and internal circulation. And these concerns are addressed and supported by the evidence given to the inquiry by Mr. Dealey in particular. And we take each in turn. The Council has adopted the Essex Design Guide, and thus the guide is a material consideration and a useful tool in assessing the quality of new schemes. The Essex Design Guide is clear in the advice it offers in respect of amenity space within new development. Essentially, it advances a cascade approach. The starting point is for development above 1 hectare, that at least 25 square metres of private amenity space for each home should be provided. If this cannot be achieved, balconies should be provided, which should be of a gross floor area of 5 square metres for homes and apartments with more than 1 bedroom. It's common ground that the appeal scheme first fails to deliver 25 square metres of private space for each home, as just 5.4 square metres of communal space per new home is offered, as confirmed by Ms. Roberts and as set out in Mr. Dealey's evidence. Secondly, the scheme fails to deliver balconies of 5 square metres for each apartment with more than 1 bedroom, and the extent of provision is now set out in ID 22 and in Mr. Dealey's proof at paragraph 9.11. Notably, the proposal does not even go so far as to meet the Build to Rent Good Practice Guide, which advises as good practice the provision of between 6 to 10 square metres per dwelling of shared external space. The appellant has placed some considerable reliance, particularly through Ms. Roberts' evidence on this guide, which, ironically enough, Ms. Roberts was in part responsible for. Thus, the appeal scheme does not represent good practice. The appellant's response is essentially threefold. First, it suggests that the Essex Design Guide, at least so far as amenity space is concerned, is not directed at high-density urban schemes. As a proposition, that is nonsense. There is nothing whatsoever in the Essex Design Guide to support this. The guide expressly applies to apartment and relaxes the 25 square metre starting point, no doubt in recognition of the difficulties in achieving that level of provision in higher density urban schemes. The Essex Design Guide has been adopted expressly by the Council for use in Basildon Borough, which includes large urban areas such as Basildon Town Centre. Secondly, the appellant says that balconies would not be appropriate for public-facing elevations or in Basildon Town Centre in particular. This proposition, too, is without foundation. There are multiple instances of balconies acceptably being incorporated into elevations of new apartment blocks facing the public realm, and Miss Roberts, not Mr. Roberts, forgive me, Miss Roberts, at her appendices on page 33 shows one example arising on a build-to-rent scheme. The Council has no policy to support the appellant's approach, and the Essex Design Guide does not suggest that there is any such problem. Further, the pre-application response letter of the 13th of July 2020 records that it was acknowledged that the BTR operator did not want balconies, although there is in fact no confirmed operator. The appellant has not produced any meaningful evidence to demonstrate balconies are not appropriate in or are adverse to the character or appearance of Basildon Town Centre, and any amenity considerations in terms of ensuring balconies are not inappropriately used is a management matter. Thirdly, the appellant pleads exceptionality in that the approach set out in the Essex Design Guide does not apply to build-to-rent schemes, principally by reason of the intended internal communal space. And we make the following points in response. Firstly, the Essex Design Guide makes no exception for any form of tenure. Secondly, it may be thought that the need for private amenity space, such as balconies, would not be addressed or overcome by communal internal space. Thirdly, in quantitative terms, the communal internal space amounts to just 1.3 square metres per dwelling on the basis of 655 square metres of internal communal space to be provided. And on any basis, this is a modest amount. Moreover, what in fact will be provided within this area of internal communal space is wholly speculative at this stage. And as Ms. Roberts confirmed in cross-examination and indeed in her proof of evidence, the form that shared amenity space will take and the facilities, if any, offered are matters to be determined when an operator has been secured and are, in large measure, cost-driven. The appellant has resolutely offered no commitment in terms of the form of facilities to be delivered as internal communal space. As such, that small amount of internal amenity space, that a small amount of internal amenity space will be offered, is not reasonable mitigation for the substantial deficiency in the external amenity space proposed and the consequential departure from the Essex design guide. This, we submit, is a major failing of this scheme. It provides insufficient and inadequate communal and private external amenity space. The result is unequal access to such space, given that the communal external space fails in quantitative terms to meet the expectations of the Essex Design Guide, and that usable balconies are not equally distributed in accordance with that guide. Secondly, with regard to the residents' internal accessibility and circulation space, so you've heard a lot of evidence and views on the acceptability of corridor length and quality. Ultimately, what cannot be avoided is that for some residents of the east and west blocks, whose homes are above podium level, and particularly those at the northernmost apartments, will have to negotiate approximately 40 metres of corridor at podium and at apartment level, which is contrary to best practice, and will receive no natural light or ventilation. This will, of course, be the last part of a journey which involves entering the scheme within the central block at street level and then leaving the block to cross the podium in the open air before entering the eastern and west blocks. Such an arrangement does not represent good design, as Mr. Dealey confirmed. Such an arrangement is not necessary and is not unavoidable. The decision not to provide cores to ground level in the east and west blocks is, as Ms. Roberts confirmed, in the main driven by reducing revenue costs. The absence of introducing cores to ground level also, of course, leads to a single point of entry from Market Square and a development which counterintuitively turns its back on Town Square and St. Martin's Square, thereby not contributing to inclusivity and a sense of place. So we invite you to approach Ms. Roberts' evidence of home view surveys with caution. The questions asked have not been disclosed in evidence. Also, without context, for example, the level of external amenity space and an understanding of the overall journey from street to apartment door in quantitative and qualitative terms, the responses are largely meaningless and certainly do not justify the approach adopted here. The scheme does not, we submit, generate a high standard of amenity for future users, and as such is in conflict with Part F of paragraph 130 of the framework. So your next main issue, mitigation measures secured by condition and obligation. The appellant and the planning authority have agreed a list of suggested planning conditions, and so without prejudice to the council's primary case, you are invited to attach those conditions to a planning permission should the appeal be allowed. And a planning obligation has been agreed, and the council has explained in core document E5 how the obligation meets the SIL regulations test so as to be a material consideration in the determination of the appeal. So we turn then finally to planning policy and the planning balance. We've explained by reference to the two main substantive issues how and why the proposal does not meet safe policy BES of the local plan, nor does it meet policies within the framework. It is common ground that the council cannot demonstrate a 5-year supply of deliverable sites for housing and that the council's housing delivery has been constrained, and it's common ground that the tilted balance is engaged. The following issues then arise. Firstly, there is a dispute as to the extent of the housing supply shortfall. The council contends that there is approximately 3.5 years of supply. That is the position as of the base date of the 1st of April of this year. And the council's response submitted on the 1st of December to the opposing party's representation confirms that without any account being taken of new sites for which planning permission has been granted since the 1st of April, supply is now approximately 3.3 years. And of course, 274 new homes have, however, been approved since the 1st of April on sites not included in the assessment as at the base date. The position is, as always, dynamic. But the council's case to you, sir, is that supply is approximately 3.5 years. The Rule 6 parties in particular take a different and more pessimistic view, and the Council has responded to their points. However, whether the supply is 3.5 years or a little below that, the Council accepts that there is a significant shortfall in supply, and the contribution made by the appeal scheme must attract substantial weight in the planning balance. And notably, Sir, Mr. Mumby considers that the difference makes no real difference to the planning balance in this appeal. Secondly, the Council is taking meaningful steps to accelerate delivery. The Council has published and is pursuing an action plan as policy requires. The Council is a substantial landowner in Basildon in particular, and is actively and conscientiously bringing forward sites in its control on an accelerated basis on land in its control, including through its housing delivery arm, Centre Homes. Thirdly, so far as the benefits of the scheme advanced by the appellants are concerned, these are indeed positives. However, the weight to be attached to these is rather more nuanced. The appellant has not put forward any case to suggest that the quantum or form of development proposed is the only viable scheme for the appeal site. The appeal site is, as the appellant contends, a brownfield town centre site in a sustainable location. And there is no basis whatsoever to conclude that if the appeal is dismissed for the reasons advanced by the Council, that an alternative form of development cannot or will not come forward which responds to the reasons for refusal. The appellant has not suggested to the contrary, and the economic and environmental benefits associated with the appeal scheme would, in large measure, be delivered by any scheme on the appeal site, and Mr. Harris's evidence as to benefits must be considered in that context. Fourthly, in the tilted balanced, Save Policy BES 12 accords with the MPPF, and the conflict with it can and should be given weight in that balance, notwithstanding that it is deemed to be out of date, as indeed can and should the conflict with the policies of the emerging local plan for Basildon Borough, identified in the reasons for refusal, with weight commensurate to that emerging plan's progress towards adoption. Fifthly and finally, with regard to the balance itself, we have demonstrated that the proposed development gives rise to substantial conflict with the MPPF, in particular paragraphs 130 and 134. It is deficient in design and harms townscape character and appearance. And this, we say, is a significant adverse effect. The framework attaches considerable weight to good and sympathetic form and design. And there is no basis to start from a point that such a deficiency can or should inherently be given more limited weight than the benefits of a development to housing supply. And so the recent decision in High Barnet produced by Mr. Lowndes in his rebuttal demonstrates this. It is submitted here that the adverse effects of this scheme, which generates a substantial conflict with the MPPF, significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits, including the contribution to housing supply in a constrained borough. The planning permission should, we submit, be refused, and we, sir, would invite you to dismiss the appeal accordingly. So unless I can be of any further assistance, those are the submissions on behalf of the Local Planning Authority.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards. 11:10, so we will take the mid-morning break. Mr. Linus, when the ink is dry on your closings, if you could forward those to Mr. Salter and then in due course to the other parties, please.
Sir, I'll do that now. That's absolutely fine, sir.
And we'll resume at 11:40.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. The inquiry is resumed. Mr. Linus, if I could invite your closing submissions on behalf of the appellant, please.
Thank you, sir. Sir, as we explained in opening, this proposal seeks permission for a much-needed mixed-use scheme comprising flexible commercial floor space and 492 one- and two-bedroom residential apartments with parking, servicing, and extensive and attractive communal areas. It will breathe life and vitality into the town centre in line with the council's aspirations for the area, as well as making a substantial contribution to the council's housing shortfall. The appeal site is currently occupied by a poorly performing and dated 3 to 4 story building. A large proportion of the units on the site are now vacant. The building is tired and reaching the end of its functional life. That the principle of this residential-led mixed-use development here is accepted by the council is hardly surprising. This is a previously developed site in a highly accessible town centre location, just 140 metres from the railway station with 4 trains an hour to London. The wider need for regeneration of Basildon is clear and, as we explained further below, urgent. The town centre was constructed largely through the 50s and 60s as a new town. A number of buildings, including the appeal site, have now passed their useful life. The council's 2015 urban characterisation and design review identified that the town centre has a tired air and that its physical fabric is fading. In addition to this physical decline, local competition and changing shopping habits have resulted in underutilisation of the town centre and a rise in the number of vacant units, 18% at present. So it's a matter of agreement that the provision of modern, flexible and commercial spaces represents a beneficial use of the site, and that will encourage new footfall in the wider town centre. It's also agreed that the addition of several hundred residential units in the heart of the town will breathe much needed life into retail and leisure businesses. Sir, this need, though, is only part of a much deeper need for housing in the local area. It's common ground the council is well short of being able to demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply. And as set out in the recent notes submitted by Mr. Harris, the appellant does not accept that the recent suggested uplift in supply from 2.4 to 3.3 years has been sufficiently established by the council. Even at 3.3 years supply, which is higher than we're prepared to accept, substantial weight should be accorded to the proposed contribution to housing supply as part of a scheme with such compelling regenerative benefits. A supply of 2.4 years should be accorded even greater weight, although it's not necessary by any means to make this scheme acceptable. Now, it's agreed that in any view, the scheme would make an important contribution to addressing a serious shortfall around 2,000 homes, even on the council's figures. The town centre and this site within it is agreed to play a vital role in addressing this deficit. The council's had to prepare a housing delivery test action plan by sanction under the NPPF in response to its persistent under-delivery of housing. One of its key actions to address the substantial housing supply shortfall is to increase capacity in the town centre. And if the council is to make good on this commitment, it's clear and it's conceded that an increase in height and density will be required in the town centre. In his evidence on behalf of the council, Mr. Lowndes accepted the need to significantly increase density in the town centre, and Basildon is a green belt authority where policy SD2 of the draft local plan makes clear that development should come forward first in urban settlements to limit the loss of green belt land. This is, of course, consistent with the framework which requires local planning authorities to make as much use as possible of suitable brownfield sites before concluding that exceptional circumstances exist to justify changes to green belt boundaries. The council accepts that granting permission for the scheme would be consistent with its policy objective and the wider sustainability benefits that avoiding green belt development would provide. The draft plan, which was submitted for examination in March 2019, explained that the OAN for Basildon was between 972 and 986 homes a year, or around 20,000 over 20 years, which even then represented a significant uplift on the historical rate of development. Mr. Lowndes rightly described these numbers as huge. Even at that stage, the draft plan only made provision for 17,791 homes, leaving a shortfall of approximately 10%. In fact, the council accepted it could only realistically deliver 15,465 over 20 years and set this as a minimum target. A shortfall, therefore, between levels of need and a notional requirement, and between identified supply and that requirement. Around 9,000 of those homes will be provided in urban areas using previously developed land, A minimum of around 1,100 were to be provided as part of town centre regeneration. And reference is made in the draft plan to the 2012 Basildon Town Centre Master Plan, which identified the potential for 1,500 to 2,000 homes to be delivered, even then acknowledging that the way to achieve this was to increase height in the town centre to an average of between 4 and 7 stories. The 2018 residential audit increased this potential by 10% to 2,128, a figure which was translated into policy R2 of the draft plan, and the scheme is accepted to be consistent with this policy and to help meet this audit figure. But, sir, these figures, including the audit, as well as any assumptions about density or height on which they were based, are accepted to still fall well short of allowing the OAN to be met with no pathway to meeting it. In January 2021, after significant delay to the local plan process, the council submitted responses to a series of questions from the inspector. One of the inspector's questions was why the draft plan, including the targets set in policy R2, didn't meet the OAN. The council responded that since the submission of the draft plan, it had published a further land and urban capacity study for the town centre, i.e. the regeneration strategy, which had identified the potential to deliver at least 4,200 homes there, representing a net increase of 3,000 or so in the previously identified urban capacity. The council explained that on this basis, it was confident it could now meet OAN. The regeneration strategy had emphasised how encouraging more people to live in the town centre was fundamental to achieving the council's vision. And it was clear from the strategy that the uplift in capacity had come predominantly from an acceptance of greater height in the town centre, including in the station and barren section where the site sits, and which was identified as having the capacity for a further 840 residential units. The inspector responded, noting that the impact of the regeneration strategy would be positive and help address his concern about the plan not meeting its OAN in full. The council accepts that this positive impact would remain true today in the context of this current appeal. Now, so the council, as a result of a change in political leadership, no longer supports the regeneration strategy, but whilst it may consider it can easily discard the detailed work commissioned by the previous administration, it cannot escape its substantial OAN and the pressing national policy requirements to meet it. It acknowledges there is nothing to suggest that the figures in the draft plan are a reliable basis for planning future housing provision in the area, and at present it only means, which the council has identified to close the housing gap, is to significantly increase density and, in considered locations, height in the town centre. The regeneration strategy is still listed as part of the local plan evidence base, and it remains consistent with the council's own recognition that it's necessary to increase the capacity of the town centre to deliver much more housing. That resulted from the advice of expert master planners, commercial agents, and officers who had conducted a thorough urban appraisal of the town centre and reached informed views on its capacity for new development. No other options have been identified to address that need, and individual development proposals stand ready to meet it. In these circumstances, housing need is a growing concern, and with no clear or reliable timetable for the adoption of the local plan, the ability of the scheme to help address urgent and substantial housing needs should be accorded a very significant weight. And so there's no sensible dispute that there must be an increase in the density of the town centre to meet this need. And when a regeneration strategy dating back to 2012 itself recognises the benefits of increased height within the centre in the context of known land ownerships of the time and well before the emergence of the latest housing need figures, the justification for taller buildings in the right locations in the centre becomes ever clearer. That conclusion is supported not only by the analysis which underpinned the regeneration strategy of 2020, but the assessment of the town centre conducted for the purpose of this appeal. And we turn to that now, sir. And let's deal with the character of the town centre. Mr. Lowndes accepted the summary of the construction of the town centre set out in the 2012 master plan. This explains that fundamentally the original concept of the master plan in the 50s was a retail core based on a strong east-west link encircled by a ring road circuit and then residential suburbs. At the time, it was recognised by the Development Corporation that it was a function of the retail core that had driven the form of the buildings, effectively limiting height to 2 to 4 stories. The corporation's chief planner expressed the view in 1962 that the town centre had a varied street scene without any unity or civic presence. In many ways, these observations were prescient. The Council's 2012 master plan has noted the new town model is now considered to lack balance and is criticised for placing too much emphasis on traffic movement, poor building design, and monofunctional land use zoning, creating the perception of a lack of unity. It accepted that a greater mix of land uses was necessary, and that in a context where perennial housing demand was not being met, the centre would benefit from an overall higher density. The Council accepts that these were and remain fair criticisms. That's not to say there are no positive elements of the town centre which enable its character to be understood. As Mr. Cafferty and Mr. Jackson explained, it retains high quality spatial framework with a strong east-west access punctuated by large public spaces, with some interest deriving from its new town origins, but it is a character that has its flaws and has degraded over time. The 2012 master plan noted that a greater mix of land uses in the centre was necessary to create a vibrant centre and was essential for regeneration. Town centre living in Basildon, it said, is a key component of the success of the regeneration of the town centre as a whole. It said the network of public spaces lacks a fluid retail circuit. The physical fabric of the town centre is fading, and there is a lack of town centre housing in communities. Similar themes were still evident in the Council's 2015 Urban Characterisation Design Review, which was carried out to provide an evidence base for the draft local plan, and is in fact referenced in the draft design policies of that plan. And as we said, it identified that town centre had a tired air and the physical fabric of the town was fading. It identified significant problems in the retail offer, a lack of town centre housing in communities, a distinct lack of nighttime economy as well, and it endorsed the opportunity of major regeneration, as well as the potential for the enclosure of streets and other spaces. And building on that, sir, the draft local plan is also clear in its negative identification of the centre, identifying a strong segregation between land uses and the need for further enhancement. Now, sir, that the Council has been discussing the issues facing the town centre since at least 2012 demonstrates, as Mr. Lowndes accepted, how the need for regeneration is now urgent. None of the assessments undertaken of how the town centre should achieve this revitalisation identified any particular approach to architectural form, appearance, or materials as distinctive. None of them suggested that greater height and density could not be achieved, or that building taller buildings was somehow inconsistent in principle with maintaining a strictly defined character to the town centre. None of them has resulted in any heritage designation, a notable feature of a centre as established as this one. To the extent that the Council relies on a general character of the town centre that it sees as dominated by a preponderance of 2 to 4 storey buildings, it's difficult to somehow divorce that assessment entirely from the issues that it itself acknowledges as facing the town centre. The prevalent low-rise urban form on which it relies was fundamentally driven by a focus on a retail function which it now accepts needs to change in a centre which requires fundamental renewal. But in any event, its characterisation of the centre fails to recognise the greater variety within the centre, which also in itself confirms its scope to accommodate change. Since the development of the retail buildings of the Regional Master Plan and the development of Brook House, it's agreed that the centre has seen significant change. As Mr. Lowndes accepted, the townscape is constantly evolving. Brook House was introduced 5 years after the preparation of the original master plan in response to perceived deficiencies of function and monotonously horizontal form. The railway station brought a significant change in 1974. The western end of the centre in particular, which is a significant element of the context for the scheme, now contains a civic function which emerged after the master plan, including Basildon Centre, developed in the mid-1980s, including the council offices in the centre, and the theatre rather. The Westgate Shopping Centre, built in the late 1990s, and the Bell Tower to St Martin's Church, built in 1999. As we explain in a moment, these and other buildings contribute to a more varied character that is expressed in both height and architectural treatment. Dealing specifically with height, sir, the town centre, as defined in the proposals map, now contains a number of tall buildings, including Brook House, Great Oaks, Kelting House, Acorn House, the Icon, and Trafford House, as well as the recently consented GS8, which is obviously still to be built. There was some debate at the inquiry about which buildings can and cannot be considered to be in the core of the town centre as opposed to periphery. Now, this is a somewhat sterile debate, we say, because what really matters is not whether a building falls on one side or the other of an arbitrary line, like the one apparently drawn by the council to distinguish Brook House from Great Oaks, when the two are in fact perceived as lying next to each other, but rather what it contributes to the broader townscape character. As to this, the 2015 design review refers simply to the town centre having several tall buildings and structures in comparison with other new towns, without seeking to make any distinction between core or periphery. Mr. Jackson put it helpfully in the wider context of the centre when he said there is not a black and white line. In any event, both Mr. Jackson and Mr. Lowndes agreed that at the very least, the 17-storey equivalent Brook House and 11-storey Great Oaks House fall within the core of the town centre. And the simple reality is that the core of the centre already contains more than one tall building and is far from uniform in height. As Mr. Jackson demonstrated by reference to the aerial view of the centre, there is a variety of height within the centre overall, even between the 2 to 4 stories in the retail core and the tallest elements. Northgate House at 6 stories is but one example, and Brook House can already be seen in the context of other tall buildings, in particular Great Oaks House itself. Apart from the overall variety in height, a notable feature of taller buildings within the town centre is a discernible relationship between form and function. Brook House is residential, so too is the Icon. Great Oaks House contains offices. Trafford House was offices, the Ford HQ, but is now recognisably residential. In a context where it's common ground that further residential development would bring life and activity to the centre, as Brook House was intended to, there's no reason why this should be dictated instead by a lower lying 2 to 4 storey form that is largely restricted to retail development, the form of which follows its own function, and on which the council does not wish to exclusively rely for the renewal of the centre. In this context, sir, it's entirely understandable why the 2015 review didn't suggest, contrary to the council's current position, that the maintenance of a prevailing height of 2 to 4 stories was necessary to retain any local distinctiveness. In fact, as Mr. Lowndes agreed, it identified the lack of landmark built development as an issue for legibility. Similarly, it's also agreed there's nothing in adopted or emerging guidance or policy which is prescriptive about controlling height in any way to maintain the character of the centre. Turning to materials and building styles, the town centre also exhibits variety in terms of materials and building styles, particularly in the western end where the appeal site sits, which Mr. Jackson described as being more varied in terms of uses, ages and forms of building, and is larger in scale and grain in the eastern part of the town centre. Mr. Lowndes himself accepted, for example, that the Basildon centre, including the theatre, had a stepped elevation and a variation in height, not a uniform horizontality. The Gothic-inspired glass form of the St. Martin's campanile creates a contrast in height and form. The Westgate shopping centre has a drum corner treatment with little or no active frontage, and the metal cladding on the college building to the south of the appeal site is a new facade material for the centre, which adopts an angled rather than straight form. Its fenestration is not used to define any strong sense of horizontality. It has a singularised base with a constant black form and no cantilevering. There are single-storey glazed pavilions in Town Square, and the Westgate Centre, Basildon Centre, St. Martin's Church, Northgate, and the existing M&S building are all in brick, as of course is Brook House, notwithstanding the use of concrete elsewhere in the town centre. On East Walk, there's some variation in height and building alignment along the frontage, and the Eastgate Shopping Centre entrance confirms there's not uniformity of building line either. The centre already exhibits variation, therefore, and we say that serves to undermine Mr. Lowndes' assertion that the quality of the local townscape is essentially and simply characterised by low, horizontally arranged buildings, continuous frontages and building alignment with modernist architecture. Nothing, as we said in the review, identified any particular approach to form, appearance or materials as distinctive. As far as wayfinding and animation is concerned, the town centre, and particularly the western end, suffers from a lack of wayfinding and animation. The 2012 master plan noted the town centre has a strong east-west bias, which is not balanced out by significant north-south routes. It noted that St Martin's Square lacked the activity and enthusiasm that it has the capacity to sustain. It identified opportunities to develop new homes to create town centre sustainable communities and to improve linkages and connections into the town centre on foot and public transport. It said approach and arrival lack urban significance. First impressions are negative, gateway experience is poor. It indicated that taller buildings north of Station Square, Transit Mall and along Fodderwick would benefit the legibility of the town centre if placed strategically at key arrival points and en route to the town centre. Furthermore, extending the massing profile and height in key locations will also assist the legibility of the core. Key locations could include along principal town centre routes. We say the appeal scheme is fully consistent with these aspirations, which, as we've said, and was not recognised in the council's closing, were based on different assumptions of housing need and property market conditions. As we said, the design review noted that opportunities should be maximised to create new landmark buildings and that key nodes and gateways should be established and marked by key buildings. The 2020 urban appraisal noted in the evening activity is focused to the east of the town centre and St Martin's Square suffers from a lack of activation. In addition, the western end of the square feels empty and desolate, primarily because of the blank frontages that line both sides. The 2021 Quality Review Panel also noted that north-south connections in the town centre lack presence, particularly around connections with the existing transport hubs and bus stations. And so these findings were endorsed by Mr Jackson and Mr Cafferty in their oral and written evidence, and Mr Lowndes agreed that wayfinding in the town centre could benefit from improvement. And so we return to these aspects of character below when dealing with the council's case. But before we do that, it's worth placing that case in the context of what the scheme would provide for the town centre. So I don't read all of this section out, but there is no real dispute as to the benefits of the scheme, which include the following. The delivery of housing, which we've already referred to. I add there that the fact that these homes are being delivered on a build-to-rent basis is an added benefit. It's common ground that 15% of Basildon's residents could afford to rent privately but could not afford to purchase their own property. The scheme will meet this particular need and diversify the local property market. And as Ms. Roberts explained, I made the same mistake as learned friend, with apologies to Ms. Roberts. As she explained, build-to-rent developments can generally deliver housing into the market much more quickly than dwellings built for sale. Regeneration, secondly, sir. It's a key objective of the council, and our scheme will place at least 1,200 new residents into the centre, increasing footfall and spending power, supporting struggling local business. The provision of flexible commercial space, incubator space, and a potential healthcare community facility will contribute to the town centre as well. And as I indicate, add much needed street activation and animation in the western part of the town. Next, sir, it will enclose public spaces in a beneficial way. The tallest 17-storey element of the scheme will directly address St Martin's Square and provide a welcome sense of enclosure to the large open space, something which Mr Lowndes accepted was a valid design objective. Mr Cafferty explained in evidence in chief how the Essex Design Guide suggests that a suitable relationship be established between the width of the space and the height of its enclosing buildings to ensure that enclosure operates at a satisfactory human scale. The ratio of height to width should be around 1:1, something which the proposed development satisfactorily achieves. The guide is, of course, only that, but illustrates a logical design principle that has independent merit, as a visit to St Martin's Square amply demonstrates. Next, sir, improving legibility and wayfinding. As Mr Lowndes accepted, the appeal site marks the confluence of the east-west retail spine, an important public square, St Martin's, and a direct route into the town centre from the station. Both Mr Cafferty and Mr Jackson explained that the placement of a tall building on this site, such as a proposed development, would perform a key wayfinding and marker role within the townscape, and that would help address some of the problems with the legibility of the centre that we've identified, and that role was acknowledged by council officers in the February report. Next, sir, it would provide a safer town centre environment. The inquiry heard representations from a local ward councillor who identified this part of the town centre as a high crime area. As Mr. Harris explained, the scheme will provide a safer environment with improved active frontages, increased natural surveillance with occupied units and residential above. The building will be fully managed and will significantly increase footfall, and the scheme has been designed to follow secure by design principles, which are secured via agreed condition 46. Turning next to build to rent. Ms. Roberts provided compelling and we say unchallenged evidence that BTR development brings a number of other benefits, including the following. It's purpose-built, designed with customers in mind, and in common with other schemes, that this proposed development will incorporate dedicated on-site staff with a strong management ethos based on maximising the customer experience. Secondly, because it's based on scale and is controlled by a single owner, it presents an opportunity to deliver significant social economic value for both the investor and the consumer, particularly in higher density urban schemes. Through that aggregation, where the developer is able to provide a superior overall amenity offer, facilities and service within the scheme, which the consumer is able to enjoy, and for commensurately less than the equivalent in a single rented buy to let type property. The model is such that owners and operators are highly incentivized to ensure that the quality of the premises and communal spaces is maintained to a high level to attract a continuous stream of new renters. And fourthly, the provision of high quality communal and amenity space and management fosters a sense of community amongst residents. And this came to the fore, as Ms. Roberts explained, during the COVID lockdowns, during which residents and staff of comparable BTR schemes were able to work together to look after one another by, for example, providing additional space to families and contacting residents to offer support. In cross-examination, it was put to Ms. Roberts that no BTR operator has yet been appointed for the scheme. I would suggest this may have some bearing on the nature and extent of amenity space that's provided. In fact, it is, as Ms. Roberts explained in re-examination, unusual for a BTR operator to be appointed before permission has been obtained. But the appellant has, however, taken advice from BTR consultants and discussed the scheme with potential operators, and that has shaped the design of the scheme and helped ensure it will provide a product that's attractive to residents and, as a result, to investors and operators. Indeed, the appellants already obtained a written expression of interest for one operator, NIDO, which Ms. Roberts found entirely unsurprising given her appraisal of the scheme. She went on to explain that whilst the build-to-rent nature of this scheme will be secured by the Section 106 agreement, it's also clear that any operator will want to ensure the scheme is delivered in such a way as to make it attractive to its target demographic. A BTR management strategy was also included with the planning application. Ultimately, if there were any concern about the quality of service and amenity provision within the scheme, this could be secured by the imposition of a condition requiring the approval of a management strategy or form of provision. Although, as Ms. Roberts explained, this would be unusual and it is unnecessary. As far as educational benefits are concerned, the inquiry heard representations from the head of South Essex College, who's worked closely with the appellant to ensure that the scheme aligns with the recently completed college building. She explained that the modern workspace and incubator space provided will support the creation of jobs in the town centre and support spin-off businesses for college students. She expressed concern that if the appeal is not allowed, the college will remain the only new development in that part of the town, and as a result, the town would not realise its regenerative ambition. The college will also not benefit from the reanimated public realm that the development offers. She stated that she looked forward to working with the appellant and the council to deliver this very welcome scheme. So there are also wider economic benefits. As explained by Mr. Harris and not disputed, the scheme will provide a number of wider benefits, including construction over a 30-month period benefiting local businesses and services, assisted by an employment and skills plan secured by the Section 106, the creation of 130 new jobs and a range of new skilled and unskilled roles, the improvement of landowner and retail confidence in the town centre, and with it, its ability to attract investment, and fourthly, the wider infrastructure improvements secured by the Section 106. Furthermore, there are wider environmental benefits. It will involve the demolition of the existing poorly performing building and its replacement with a new purpose-built building designed to be of a high build quality, incorporating sustainable building and management techniques. These include a fabric-first approach and deploying low carbon and renewable technologies to lower energy consumption. It's also a highly sustainable town centre location with limited car parking provision, which will encourage sustainable modes of transport. The scheme will additionally secure biodiversity net gain. Conclusions on benefits then, sir. On behalf of the council, Mr. Lowndes has sought to suggest that some of these benefits could be delivered by an alternative scheme, particularly one with lesser height, and this theme was repeated in closing, but it ignores two important factors. First, no such alternative scheme has been identified, let alone been shown to be viable. There is, in short, no alternative before this inquiry, and no evidence that one would come forward. What we do know is that Basildon Town Centre is in urgent need of regeneration and of housing. This scheme could go a significant way to addressing both, and in a very short period of time. Secondly, whilst the scheme at lesser height might, in theory anyway, be able to deliver some of these benefits, it couldn't deliver all of them or to the same extent. What this scheme does so successfully is to combine the creation of wayfinding, enclosure and activation with an injection of a substantial amount of residential housing to improve footfall, animation, retail spending and housing supply. The council has also sought to suggest that the introduction of a tall building on this site is not necessary. However, there's no article of national or local policy which imposes any test of necessity. Indeed, it's quite the wrong question to be asking. The proper approach, as set out in the recent West Ealing appeal decision, is to ask whether the site is worthy of the gesture of a tall building, and if so, whether the proposal is otherwise appropriate. We say this site is quite plainly worthy of that gesture for all the reasons that we've given and those which we've developed below. And in that context, turn to the reasons for refusal. Now, although it originally identified 3 reasons, the council has, since issuing its statement of case, set these out really under 2 headings: architectural design, height, scale, massing and townscape character, and then secondly, the design, residential access and amenity. It's important, sir, we say, to put these reasons in context. In the first place, as outlined in our opening, the scheme has been approved by officers on no fewer than 3 previous occasions and by members on 2. The broad principles of the development reflect the contents of the 2020 regeneration strategy prepared by expert master planners and were endorsed, we say, by the independent Essex Quality Review Panel. The results of the QRP were that the complexity and challenging aspects the existing town centre offers were all recognised, as well as the opportunities that both Basildon and the wider county of Essex have to offer. The overall consensus of the panel recognised the aspirations and drive from both the council and their appointed master planners, concluding that the ambitious long-term vision and principles will seek high quality and coordinated development throughout the town centre. I'll come back to the QRP momentarily, sir. The council's decision to pose this appeal is in reality born of politics, arising from a change in administration rather than a coherent, articulated assessment of what the town centre needs. As Mr. Lowndes confirmed, there's been no material change of circumstances, we say, to justify the change of position, either on the ground or in policy terms since this time. Mr. Lowndes disagreed with the suggestion made to the inquiry by the leader of the council himself that the NPPF had introduced a new test that development should be well designed. Abandoning a regeneration strategy cannot assist its position. In fact, it's the latest assessment of the capacity in the town centre to accept new development produced by these independent master planners. It should be given weight. Although the council claims to be reviewing its vision for the regeneration of the town centre, it has not offered this inquiry any alternative solutions to the urgent needs facing Basildon. And it's notable, sir, that the council's objections to the proposed development are based essentially on questions of character and design. It has not raised any concern about the tangible impact which are often associated with tall buildings, such as effects on daylight, sunlight, overshadowing, wind, microclimate, and the setting of heritage assets. We say this is a remarkable achievement and is testament to the scheme's intelligent and careful design. Set against this context and the benefits of the scheme, we say the reasons for refusal are both myopic and self-defeating. But before examining their detail, it's also worth confirming the agreement that when assessing whether a proposal achieves good design under the framework, being sympathetic with local character does not mean that development must simply repeat it. Appropriate change necessarily does not mean maintain, and the exhortation to optimize the potential of the site is as much an aspect of good design as other principles espoused by national policy. All this is agreed, sir. Similarly, the National Design Guide emphasises the need to understand context to inform or influence proposals, not to prescribe their form or appearance. Well-designed places, it says, do not need to copy their surroundings in every way. And as it says again, it's appropriate to introduce elements that reflect how we live today, to include innovation or change such as increased densities. Thus, all design approaches and architectural styles are visually attractive when designed well. It goes on to say that tall buildings require special consideration, but it's recognised that well-designed tall buildings play a positive urban design role in the built form. They act as landmarks, emphasising important places and making a positive contribution to views in the skyline. And insofar as the framework includes new references to beauty, it's agreed that if it can be shown that a development would attain a very high quality of design, this is sufficient to justify the conclusion that it accords with national policy and guidance. And for the reasons we'll come to, we say that conclusion is amply justified in the case of this scheme. Dealing first with architectural design, height, scale, massing, and character. So the basis for this reasons for refusal has narrowed during the course of the inquiry. In particular, the council has offered no real evidence to support its assertion that any overshadowing caused by the development will adversely affect the pedestrian experience in the public space to the north of the scheme. This is unsurprising, we say, in the light of the clear evidence supported by technical analysis provided by Mr. Harris. As for understanding townscape character, the suggestion by Mr. Lowndes that the appellant had not sufficiently understood or interpreted local context and distinctiveness was based on a partial and misplaced reading of the DAS and the wider evidence. As we've indicated, the appellant has worked closely with the council since the pre-application stage. The DAS includes a section on context, but as was agreed, it's necessary to look beyond this section alone to see the wider contextual analysis carried out by the appellant's architects, supported by further evidence as explained by Mr. Cafferty in the presentation and evidence in chief. As Mr. Harris put it, the DAS was in fact first class and exemplary. It achieves the objective of articulating a clearly discernible design rationale for the scheme it supports, and no more than a cursory examination of the relatively limited contextual work in the DASs for the recently approved Trafford House and GS8 schemes, accepted without criticism by the council, is necessary to bear this out. In fact, the appellant has worked hard to develop a clear understanding of the townscape character, and this is fed directly into the design of the scheme. Contrary to the suggestion in the council's closing, the DAS displays its merits on its own terms, and it is entirely appropriate that the appellant provides an independent review of its content from an experienced architect, supported by a townscape assessment prepared by another expert consultancy. It's notable as well, as Mr. Lowndes accepted, that he hadn't prepared his own full townscape and visual assessment of the scheme. And we come back to give further detail on the work that the appellants carried out. Dealing with height, scale and massing, sir, the council has signally failed to make out what appear to be the main elements of its evidence to the inquiry, namely that height is insufficiently justified, that it would be inconsistent with the prevailing townscape character, or that it would have an overbearing and domineering effect on various other townscape features, including Brook House, and we say so for the following reasons. As far as height is concerned, the height and the associated massing, ranging from 9 to 17 stories, has been robustly justified and is the product of extensive optioneering, notwithstanding the fact that, as Mr. Lowndes admitted, there's no local policy requiring this or limiting town centre building heights. The DAS contains a full and wide-ranging analysis of the history of the site and the town centre, the scale of streets and places within Basildon, including prevailing building forms and heights, the presence of tall buildings, the heritage context and role of Brook House, the network of streets, spaces and key transport routes, It demonstrates a clear understanding of the urban fabric in the centre, including its relatively low-scale buildings, before recognising the scope for scale at the western end of the retail core and explaining the logical massing approach to the fingers in the context of the New Town movement and Brick House. It also records the extensive consultation undertaken by the appellant, which shows that a lower medium height building was also considered. On the basis of this analysis, the appellant reached the conclusion that the appeal site could accommodate and indeed benefit from a building of the height of the proposed scheme because it would fulfil an identified role marking one of the key north-south routes to the town centre from the station. It would provide a much needed sense of enclosure to Market Square, Town Square, and in particular St Martin's Square, consistent with the principles of the Essex Design Guide. Thirdly, tall buildings are already a feature of the townscape, with Brick House at 17 stories and a range of other buildings from 8 to 11. The DAS rightly analysed the opportunity to create sufficient hierarchy and enhance the identity of Basildon by stepping up the scale of built form towards the centre of the retail core. And fourthly, a tall building can be delivered without significant adverse impacts on the amenity of neighbouring buildings or members of the public. That analysis has been reviewed and it's fully supported by the appellant's design and townscape witnesses. The principle of building height stepping up into the town centre, as considered in the DAS, was also expressly considered by the council when it granted permission for the GS8 scheme. This is consistent with sound urban design principles, which suggest that taller buildings can be used to signify an understanding that more intensive activity is intended where they are located, and the core of a town centre is an appropriate place to achieve this. Moreover, at the time of the inquiry, the council's website, in response to the latest administration's consultation on the regeneration of the town centre, says this about tall buildings. It endorses their potential to add significant value to the town centre, add to legibility, and contribute to character and placemaking. It confirms that in addition to just achieving housing numbers, there is also a placemaking case for height. Brick House sits alone as a prominent building of height in Basildon Town Centre. There is a strong case for it having some other accompanying building of height, and more closely defining to the world outside of the town centre that the centre is a place of importance. The appeal scheme would plainly be consistent with these aspirations. In cross-examination, Mr. Lowndes also agreed that in principle tall buildings have the potential to add significant value to the town centre. And finally, sir, the analysis contained within the DAS and the appellant's justification for height must be seen in context. As we've said, the council's own draft master plan and urban appraisals, which were being applied throughout the application process, clearly supported the provision of tall buildings on the appeal site. Secondly, the QRP gave in principle support to the scale and density presented in the master plan and raised no specific objection to the height of the proposed development. As they said, scale and density matters as presented in the draft master plan were supported in principle. Height and massing were approached in a strong manner, and it was agreed heights shown were acceptable in principle. As well as that, the opportunities to drive density up within the town centre whilst ensuring this approach is sustainable on a commercial level is seen as important. This was a clear and independent design-based endorsement of the work undertaken by the council's master planners to produce the draft master plan, including its treatment of the appeal site. And thirdly, the council's July 2020 pre-application response described the appellant's approach to height as logical and raised no objections. And sir, we were obviously entitled to have regard to all these factors when drafting the DAS in the application, and we'd have been criticised if we hadn't done so. But in any event, the evidence before the inquiry shows that if there is accepted to be justification for building at greater height in the town centre, this is in fact an obvious place to provide it. As we said, the tall buildings would sit at the intersection of the main retail spine on an important route directly north along a clear desire line from the railway station, past the unattractive first view of the nightclub and pub on the corner, and on a corner facing onto the primary civic square in the town centre, from which, in views south, the merits of greater enclosure are readily apparent. The organisation of mass overall is logical and coherent, marking on another corner of the site a positive relationship with Market Square on a further route from the station, and on another a respectful stepping down towards Brick House. this overall approach is sound and there is no cogent challenge to it. As far as the general consistency with the prevailing townscape character is concerned, Mr. Lowndes has somehow maintained the character of the town centre is derived from a 2 to 4 story general arrangement of or horizontally disposed buildings, with Brook House acting as a single landmark element. But there are a number of points here, sir. First, it's not an accurate characterisation of the town centre's character, as we've explained. A proper analysis reveals there is a variety of height within the town centre, within a wider picture of greater variety in building form than the basic analysis of the council suggests. The council's own design review noted that within the town centre, tall buildings are set adjacent to low to medium-rise buildings, a tradition established early on in the development. Mr. Lowndes also accepted that Brook House was no longer the only tall building in the core of the centre, and he accepted that the design review says nothing about the need to maintain a 2 to 4 story height in the centre. Secondly, to the extent that the character of the centre could be described in part in the manner suggested by Mr. Lowndes, this is neither deliberate nor protected. It's not deliberate in the sense that, again, as we said, there is no evidence that the original master planners set out to produce a permanently low-scale townscape. The Development Corporation's own architect did not consider there to be any sense of civic unity or presence. And as Mr. Lowndes accepted, the 2 to 4 story form of the early town centre followed the predominantly retail function of the building, which is consistent with one of the underlying rationales of the modernist movement: form follows function. When residential or office uses have been introduced, taller buildings have typically followed. Secondly, sir, it's not protected in the sense that the town centre is not a conservation area, and there are no policies in either the adopted or draft local plans which seek to preserve any prevailing 2 to 4 story character. Thirdly, Mr. Lowndes accepted that an increase in height at the appeal site could be acceptable in principle, and that any replacement would be higher than 2 to 4 stories. If the council is to come close to meeting its housing need, town centre heights will have to increase, so that even if we're correct that the town centre has a prevailing 2 to 4 story character, it's inevitable this will need to evolve. Fourth, as with the approach to height, the existing townscape character was clearly understood and taken into account in the DAS, which recognised the site of one of the original master plan blocks, the original forms of buildings in Town Square and East Walk, the importance of connections to St Martin's Square, the strong retail spine around well-connected spaces, the poor external connections away from the centre, and the need to consider street scale, having regard to other building heights in the centre. So in summary, we say the proposed development will play a positive role in the townscape. And when considering the extent to which there is any departure from any prevailing height character, it's essential to mind it wasn't deliberate, it's not specifically protected, and it must change. As for the effect on other townscape features, including Brook House, the council's case, at least initially, proceeded on the basis that Brook House has some kind of singular status that's threatened by the scheme. Mr. Lowndes moderated this view during the course of the inquiry, becoming more concerned with maintaining its dominating effect rather than any claim to singularity. But any such claim to singularity was, we say, misconceived in any event. So too was the suggestion that the proposed development would be an overly dominant element in the townscape competing with Brook House. Mr. Lowndes accepted that, in fact, the idea for the building did not feature in any of the original design plans for the town centre. The Development Corporation wanted to bring life into the centre at night and to provide accommodation for executives at the time. Insofar as it intended the introduction of height to provide for a, not the only, focal point in the design to contrast with the existing shopping development, and from afar the sea of seemingly endless housing roofs, there is no evidence to indicate that Brook House was ever intended to be the only tall building in Basildon, or that the provision of counterbalance to the low rise of the time should end there. Mr. Lowndes accepted as much. It's also agreed there's no policy or guidance being advanced by the council which seeks to protect any claimed singularity in terms of protected views or view management. As Mr. Lowndes also recognised, other new towns have had several landmark elements, and so there's no evidence that singularity is a defining concept of the new towns movement either. Mr. Lowndes accepted too that the council was not raising any concerns about distant views of the town centre, which is, we say, of some significance, given the role of brick house and its role of marking out the town centre from the horizontality of the rest of the town from further afield. But even within the town centre, brick house can already be perceived in the context of other tall buildings. This is particularly clear in viewpoints 13, 12 and 8 as shown in the TVIA. And from relevant views, it cannot be described as dominant. Mr. Lowndes accepted that brick house is largely concealed from existing views from within St Martin's Square, as shown at viewpoint 22. Views are also limited, moving towards and into the western end of Town Square. As the listing description of brick house explains, the more dominant townscape quality of brick house is most readily appreciated as part of a composition, including the retaining walls and steps leading down and into the sunken East Square. It's from these closer views, away from the appeal site, where any dominance of brick house, including its robust architectural detailing, is most readily appreciated. A principal concern of Mr. Lowndes, at least as he expressed in cross-examination, related to the impact of the proposed development on viewpoint 15. But as Mr. Jackson noted, viewpoint 15 shows the now completed cinema under construction. He explained that the massing of the proposed scheme has been carefully crafted by being broken down to avoid a wall of development and to allow daylight to penetrate Town Square, whilst opening up space for amenity provision and orienting the buildings to reflect brick house before stepping down towards brick house, with a 10-storey finger being the closest and the tallest 17-storey finger being largely hidden, as demonstrated by the wireline drawing. The tallest building would mark the intersection of the main town centre routes in relationship with St Martin's Square. The second tallest building would mark the relationship with Market Square. Attempts by the council to rely upon viewpoint 12 to illustrate the potential effects of the new buildings in St Martin's Square were misplaced, as Mr. Jackson explained, not least because they did not represent a fair depiction of the experience of standing in St Martin's Square itself. As Mr. Lowndes accepted, all of what I've described is an appropriate design move, which, when allied with the effects of distance between brick house and the scheme, mean the latter cannot sensibly be described as having a dominant effect. As Mr. Jackson stated, as pedestrians move along East Walk from viewpoint 15, the cinema will increasingly block views of brick house, minimising any sense of competition with the proposed scheme. And in views nearer brick house from East Square, brick house will continue to exert the stronger townscape influence summarised in listing description. Overall, we say it's absolutely clear that the proposed development will not be perceived to dominate brick house from any town centre views. And this is consistent, we say, with the advice given by officers to members, which I've set out, but I do not read, sir. Finally, as regards brick house, the lack of force in the council's townscape objection is revealed by the fact that it hasn't raised any heritage concerns, despite, first of all, the listing entry for brick house quite clearly recognising the building's significant townscape role, and secondly, its statutory duty to give great weight to preserving the significance of heritage assets. If the council had broader concern about the effect of the scheme on the townscape setting of brick house were not sufficient to merit a heritage objection, then those concerns should not logically have been considered to be particularly significant in a townscape context. And so the attempts by the council in closing to rely on the heritage assessment carried out on behalf of the appellant ignore the fact that the assessment found the scheme to cause no harm in closer distance views within the town centre. Its assessment of impact related to longer distant views with which the council has expressed no concerns at all. The conclusion was that the appeal scheme would reinforce the value of brick house as a high density residential building within Basildon New Town Centre and preserve key views of brick house from within Town Square, Market Square, and add considerably to the activity of the listed building setting throughout the day and into the evening in concert with the original plan for the new town centre. I give other references in the footnote. As far as other elements of the townscape are concerned, there's no dispute the scheme would be consistent with the broad urban structure of the town centre, based as it is on a broad north, south and east west alignment. It would not interfere with street and movement patterns, nor would it detrimentally affect urban structure or grain. The appeal site has the footprint of a large urban block, albeit with internal servicing yards, with which the proposals would not interfere. And as Mr. Lowndes accepted, the use of internal space to provide amenity within the development was a positive design move. The scheme would also be consistent with the elements of town centre character that relate to land use activity by bringing mixed use activity into the centre. They would not have any effect on the quality of the public realm and public art as a feature of town centre character. In fact, they would enliven the public realm and secure the conservation of the mural on the existing building in an appropriate new location. Mr. Lowndes was also wrong to suggest that the scheme will have an adverse impact on the townscape character of Market Square, Town Square, and in particular St. Martin's Square. Again, any suggestion that this scheme is somehow going to overwhelm these spaces, we say is fundamentally misconceived. Just as Brook House was conceived as a beneficial counterpoint to the horizontality of other parts of the town centre at the time, there is no reason why these buildings should not perform a similar role at a logical location for a tall building, given the later addition of the station to the town. As we've explained, the townscape character of St. Martin's Square is already varied. The proposed development is set back from the spatially generous square, and for the reasons we've given, will add much needed enclosure and animation. It will also improve rather than harm the character of Town Square and Market Square. Historic England has said of the existing building that it's not of any particular architectural or historic interest, and is of a construction that isn't notable. Its appearance and value contrast significantly with the landmark features in the town centre that have been listed, such as Brook House. It's a matter of common ground that the existing facades are of poor quality and in need of replacement. So the proposal will see this building being replaced by a high quality design. And Mr. Cafferty has explained how the proposed development will bring an improved form of and enclosure to these squares with enhanced legibility, while the high quality architecture and materials will similarly enhance the surroundings generally. No issues now taken with the effect of the scheme on the pedestrian experience in Town Square in terms of overshadowing, and it's difficult to see how any other issue could now arise in this context. Market Square would benefit from the market building on its corner. Overall, the scheme would have a significant positive and beneficial effect on character. As far as materials and design are concerned, sir, we say both Mr. Lowndes and Mr. Dealey were wrong to suggest that the scheme doesn't demonstrate any clear connection or reference to the modernist character of the town centre. In fact, we've gone to great lengths to assess the local context and respond accordingly while avoiding simple pastiche or facsimile. As we've explained, our own work and various appraisals and master plans produced by the council show that the centre exhibits a variety of materials and forms, particularly at the western end closest to the appeal site. The appellant's contextual analysis is summarised in the DAS, and further details given in Mr. Cafferty's presentation. The DAS recorded the architectural language of Basildon, including the use of brick to introduce a degree of horizontality, which mediated the verticality of Brook House, as well as the regularity of fenestration within repeated forms on East Walk, and the influence of public art within Basildon and the New Town movement. Mr. Cafferty showed how the appellant's architects have taken elements from East Walk and Brook House and broken them down in an attempt to draw inspiration from them. He explained this had led to the introduction of a ziggurat form into initial designs, which would then be removed following feedback from the QRP and replaced with further work to enhance the horizontality of the facades by adopting the horizontal brick banding with a projecting horizontal course, drawing direct inspiration from Brook House. The design also arranges the ground floor of the fingers into a sequence of two-storey brick elements to reflect the scale and organisation of the ground floor plane at East Walk. East Walk also inspired the inclusion of the pavilions within the scheme to emphasise the two-storey nature of the retail space and introduce further horizontality. The pavilions have been clad in a material designed to invoke the now removed pineapple sculpture, which Mr. Lowndes acknowledged was a nod to the materiality of public art in the centre. He also accepted in general terms the grid aesthetic and repetition of window patterns was an appropriate response to the regularity of fenestration elsewhere in the town centre. In terms of materials, Mr. Lowndes accepted that the buildings in the vicinity of the appeal site are predominantly brick, and that the QRP had responded positively to the use of brick as a key material. Brick is fundamentally not uncharacteristic of the town centre. Indeed, it is the characteristic material of brick house as the tallest building in the town centre. There's no reason why it shouldn't be employed as material here. No sensible dispute can be taken either, sir, with the building alignment on the town square. The building forms introduce active frontage along the length of the site, which is supported by the council, and the overall line of the street is preserved, and there's no strict uniformity of building alignment in the town centre anyway. Any hint at the minor setbacks would create a security risk was entirely misplaced, as we explained below, but instead the setbacks in conjunction with the subtle angling of the podiums would create visual interest in the street scene. Again, this is entirely consistent with the officer's advice to members, which I do not need to read. And we agree with it, as did members. All in all, as Mr. Cafferty explained, the scheme comprises a logical form of vertical residential form and horizontal commercial form, which come together in a balanced composition. There is no need nor justification for the simple repetition of new town architecture in this scheme, but as with any good design, it creates modern buildings which embrace the opportunities and needs of the present while taking appropriate influence from their context and the past. I turn then to design, residential access and amenity, sir. We say, dealing with accessibility in the resident's journey, there is an air of complete unreality about Mr. Deady's criticism of accessibility and circulation within the site. The suggestion that the design would harm the health of residents gives a clue to the levels of overstatement that permeated his evidence. In a statement of case, the council sought to criticise the single residential entrance for an apparent lack of presence and legibility. It's hardly surprising that there's not been able to produce any evidence to support this contention. As Mr. Cafferty has explained, the double height entrance will sit prominently at the bottom of one of the main 13-storey fingers and will provide both legibility and much needed activation to the street scene. The residential entrance is entirely rationally located to face the station, which is likely to be one of the primary access routes, and to enable the fullest active frontage to be provided onto the main retail thoroughfare in the town centre. Mr. Deady now complains that there should be more smaller residential entrances so that residents can avoid what is in reality a very short walk anyway to Market Square from elsewhere in the town centre or the station. That will obviously only serve to reduce the legibility of the scheme's access. Further, as Ms. Roberts explained, additional entrances present a greater security risk, for example, from tailgating, as well as undermining the development of community and diluting the focused service provision, such as post-collection, which is best and cost-effectively consolidated in a central area. As Mr. Cafferty explained, once residents enter the generously proportioned entrance, replete with reclaimed public artwork and a concierge desk, they will take a short flight of stairs or lift to the first floor, where they will enter the residents' lounge. Mr. Deady didn't question the logic of this arrangement, which quite clearly promotes community interaction and a sense of belonging. From there, residents in the east and west fingers will take a short covered walk through a landscaped outdoor amenity area to their particular core. They will then obviously select the lift which is closest to their front door, and from the lift they'll have no more than a 15-metre walk to their front door. The focus of Mr. Deady's concern appeared to be the 15-metre maximum walk from the nearest lift to the front door, which he described as disorientating. He suggested that residents would somehow be in a state of doubt as to when their journey would end. We say this evidence is just not credible. When asked whether he'd ever designed a corridor of more than 30 metres in length, Mr. Deady was unable to say. That is surprising if corridor length is genuinely likely to have the health implications he alleges. Occupiers who leave the lift will proceed, as they would naturally expect to, along a corridor with which they will be familiar, to a home which they will know. A couple of corner turns on a short route cannot sensibly be described as an issue for them, or for any visitors who will be capable of understanding how to identify an individual apartment in a short corridor as they would in any other apartment building. In fact, Mr. Deady accepted there was no rule of policy or guidance which dictated what the length or nature of a resident's journey to their flat should be. He made some reference to a maximum corridor length of 7.5 metres, but Mr. Cafferty rightly clarified that 90% of developments had longer corridors, and Ms. Roberts has produced evidence from the BTR Homes View survey, which shows that many other BTR schemes have longer corridors but remain highly successful schemes. And so I'll just point out the footnote there that Ms. Roberts described Home Views as the TripAdvisor of BTR, and contrary to what was put in closing, as she confirmed in cross-examination, the questions posed in the surveys are deliberately broad so as to allow open comments from residents. If there were any issues with, for instance, corridor lengths, there's ample scope within the review for those comments to be provided. Returning to the text, Sir, Mr. Daly took no issue with Ms. Roberts' evidence in all of this, and contrary to the suggestion of the council, her examples include schemes with corridors that do not experience any daylight, but in any event, as she described, the absence of daylight over short corridor lengths cannot realistically be regarded as an issue, especially within the context of a daylit journey within the scheme to the building and the daylight available to residents when they reach their homes. Her evidence also clearly described how corridors are to be viewed in a wider sense as part of the curation of the resident's journey within the scheme, including wayfinding, lighting, signage, floor finishes, etc. And there's no reason to question the application of these principles in this case. In other words, this is the design which would be entirely typical for development of this nature. In fact, the journey as a whole offers considerable benefits in terms of fostering a sense of community and encouraging residents to enjoy the attractive communal amenity spaces. To suggest that residents would somehow be harmed or even find it difficult or off-putting to experience a total journey of 40 or so metres when entering their building after an open-air walk through the amenity space simply stretches credulity. The council has also sought to assert that the proposed development does not align with the London Housing Design Guide, which states that groups of 2 to 8 dwellings per floor are usually desirable. In his proof, Mr. Daly explained that he considered his guidance to require no more than 8 dwellings per core. He conceded, though the design guide has not been adopted by the council, it doesn't form part of its planning policy. But in any event, Mr. Cafferty explained that each floor has 16 dwellings served by 2 cores, which in effect amounts to 8 dwellings per floor being served by a single core. He was right to say in this respect that in practice residents will use the core closest to their homes. He also explained that one of the underlying reasons for this suggestion in the London Housing Design Guide is that more residential cores typically provide greater street animation. However, that's not necessary in schemes such as this, where the scheme animation provided by the commercial frontage is an undisputed benefit. It's also relevant to note, we say that the guide anticipates that developments could safely accommodate up to 25 dwellings per core. And Ms. Roberts' evidence also demonstrates the absence of any correlation between core numbers and customer satisfaction in BTR schemes. Turning to unequal access to amenity space, Mr. Daly's alleged that the scheme provides unequal access to amenity space in that some dwellings are located slightly further from the rooftop gardens than others. He accepted that the maximum difference is about 20 metres and it would take a short amount of time to walk, or as Mr. Cafferty put it, no more than a few additional seconds. Again, the suggestion by Mr. Daly that this gives rise to a significant issue of inequality is just not credible. No scheme can realistically provide completely equal access to amenity space, and in the context of a trip to a rooftop garden, a few additional seconds cannot be regarded as anything other than inconsequential. Turning to balcony provision, 24% of the apartments provided within the scheme will have 5 square metre exterior balconies. The remainder will have Juliet balconies. We say the council wrongly alleges that this is inadequate, pointing in particular to the suggestion in the Essex Design Guide that the incorporation of balconies into residential accommodation will be expected where private communal space provision does not equate to 25 square metres per flat. This part of the Essex Design Guide must be read in context. Insofar as the approach to balconies is related to communal provision, this refers back to guidance which suggests that an outside space of at least 25 square metres is expected for all at densities above 50 dwellings per hectare. There's no suggestion that the guide, which appears largely designed to consider more suburban locations, contemplates much higher densities, such as those proposed for the town centre in this case. Secondly, it is expressly a guide and does not mandate any particular provision. Thirdly, Mr. Daly accepted, as he was bound to, that there's no development plan policy requiring the provision of a certain number or size of balconies, and the local plan does not require compliance with the Essex Design Guide. Fourthly, there's nothing in national policy or the design guide which requires balcony provision in principle or in any particular proportion. In respect of the quantum of balcony provision, the guide was not cited in the Council's reasons for refusing the scheme or by officers or members on any of the other occasions when the proposed development has been recommended for approval. If there was a standard to be applied, the committee report could have been expected to use it. And there is no evidence, even in its recent decisions, the Council is consistently applying it. As Mr. Harris explained, the recent Trafford House decision permitted levels of amenity space which appear to fall below 25 square metres with no requirement for any balcony provision. And in any event, sir, we say there are good reasons for the level of balcony provision proposed here. First of all, the BTR operator expressed a view that it did not want balconies provided with the scheme, and there could be negative effects to their installation. This was acknowledged by Council officers in their pre-application advice. Balcony provision was not raised as a concern by officers following the amendments. As explained, the proposed development benefits from high levels of communal amenity space. According to Ms. Roberts, this is a particular feature of BTR where the provision of private amenity often gives way to the provision of high quality communal amenities. Indeed, the proposed development performs well compared to other BTR schemes within Ms. Roberts' knowledge, and schemes with no balconies still score highly in terms of residential satisfaction. So I'll just add there, if you would turn back to footnote 181 on page 36, insofar as the closing of the Council makes reference to good practice guidance for BTR communal space, as Ms. Roberts confirmed, any difference between the guidance and the proposed space in this scheme would be marginal and of no significance. Turning back to page 38, paragraph C, as Ms. Roberts explained, balconies can be perceived by some to introduce safety issues or concerns with people throwing items from the street below. Providing a proportion only of balconies is consistent with the principle of offering BTR tenants a choice of accommodation to suit their preferences at different times of accommodation. Fourth, in design terms, balconies can often create a cluttered aesthetic to surrounding streetscape, which, as Mr. Harris explained, was also accepted by officers. And fifthly, Mr. Daly accepted that the provision of balconies on external facades would probably not be consistent with the existing character of Basildon Town Centre, and the County Council Place Services representation on the application concluded the balconies resulted in a form that was less sympathetic to the existing form of brick house and the new town development. So, sir, we say the provision of balconies within the scheme is entirely appropriate as we proposed to its context, and the overall provision of amenity space quite clearly meets the needs of residents as specifically identified in policy H25 of the draft local plan. I deal briefly with other matters, sir. Mr. Daly criticised the provision of Juliet balconies, and particularly the effect that they'll have on the internal layout of the apartments. In fact, there's nothing of substance in this point, which may explain why it wasn't raised in the Council statement of case or reasons for refusal. He accepted that the balcony doors will affect about 1 metre depth of the apartment, and that the indicative layout shown in the DAS were not fixed. He also accepted that on its own this wouldn't provide sufficient grounds to refuse planning permission. As for defensible amenity space, Mr. Daly expressed concern about an apparent failure to provide apartments at first floor podium level with sufficient defensible space. Again, this wasn't raised in either the Council statement of case or reasons for refusal. And in fact, the plans show that defensible space can be provided by planting. And Mr. Cafferty has explained that even if further space are required, this could be dealt with as a matter of detail without materially affecting the overall provision of space. As for the shared service corridor, Mr. Daly suggested that the proposal to share these corridors in the east and west fingers with commercial service users was unacceptable. But in fact, as Mr. Cafferty explained, sir, these corridors are 2 metres wide and can generously accommodate this use. He rightly described it as a perfectly safe and practical solution, and he was supported by Ms. Roberts, who saw no issue at all with it from a BTR management perspective. Again, this can hardly be described as a realistic design concern. As for security, Mr. Lowndes identified insets in the frontage to the proposed development had the potential to undermine security by creating hiding places. He indicated this point would be addressed in Mr. Daly's proof. In fact, it wasn't, and Mr. Lowndes accepted that the scheme would be assessed by the council's designing out crime team and that no issues had been raised. None of these issues comes even close to amounting to a proper basis for dismissing this appeal. And so, sir, I turn finally to the policy compliance and the planning balance. Mr. Harris explained that the scheme needs to be principally judged against the framework and policy BE 12 in the said policies of the plan. Before addressing those, it's worth noting that the development meets a number of key objectives contained in the framework. In particular, support the fundamental policy objectives of boosting housing supply, make optimal use of previously developed land in the heart of a town centre, make efficient use of land, achieving an appropriate density in a location which is well served by public transport, and provide residential development on an appropriate town centre site that will play an important role in ensuring its vitality. As for paragraph 130 of the framework, as Mr. Cafferty explained, the scheme would comply with its principles. It will function well as a mixed-use scheme, adding to the overall quality of the centre. It will provide visually attractive buildings conceived as a result of good architecture. Its buildings would provide appropriate change, including through density, increased density, while being sympathetic to local character. The scheme would help establish a stronger sense of place for the town centre, using the arrangement of street spaces, building types, and materials to create an attractive, welcoming, and distinctive place to live, work, and visit. The proposal would optimise the potential of the site to accommodate and sustain an appropriate amount and mix of development, and the scheme would be safe, inclusive, and accessible, and promote health and well-being with a high standard of amenity for existing and future users. As for paragraph 134, sir, although it's technically only necessary for schemes to comply with one of the two criteria, we say we comply with both. Mr. Harris explained that the scheme, as demonstrated by Mr. Cafferty and in the DAS, does clearly reflect local design policies and government guidance on design. It's also taken into account local design guidance in the form of the Essex Design Guide to the extent that officers consider it relevant. And further, sir, the scheme will demonstrably help to raise the standard of design more generally in the area through its design and appearance for the reasons we've given. So those conclusions have also led Mr. Harris to reach a positive conclusion in respect to compliance with adopted and draft local policy. We say that the scheme will cause no material harm to the character of the surrounding area, including the street scene, and secondly, overshadowing or over-dominance, thereby complying with local plan policy BE 12. As for policy DES 1, we've worked closely with the council to deliver regeneration. So this is one of the key benefits of the proposed development, indicating that criterion 1 is met. And against criterion 2, the scheme is a high quality design that optimises the use of land. For the reasons we've given, we also meet the requirements of policy DS4 as well as draft policy H25. So just to round off this point, in addition to those policies, there was debate at the inquiry about the relevance of the master plan and the urban appraisal. We accept that they don't have formal weight in the sense they haven't been adopted, but they do have informal weight, which arises from the fact they've been prepared by expert master planners on behalf of the council and consulted upon. The council can't simply cast aside the extensive work and analysis which underpin the strategy, and with it the coherent and well-considered view of what regeneration of the town centre that meets the council's housing needs could look like. These documents quite plainly both support the proposed development, as we've explained, and the council is unable at this inquiry to offer any alternative approach to the town centre. In summary then, we say the scheme complies with the development plan and it would merit the granted permission without delay in normal circumstances, even if there were a 5-year supply of housing. In this case, however, It's common ground that tilted balance is engaged, which required that permission be granted unless the adverse impacts of doing so would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits when assessed against the framework taken as a whole. We propose 492 homes that are clearly deliverable, indeed would have already been regarded as such, but for the council's delay in signing the 106 that was before them. And it will make a substantial contribution to the council's housing shortfall. We don't accept the 3.3-year figure proffered by the council is adequately evident, but on any view that attracts considerable weight. There are no adverse impacts of the proposed development. And it's perplexing how the council can now be suggesting that its own officers and the previous administration, after such full and lengthy engagement with the appellant, followed by repeated and conscientious consideration of the scheme, could be so wrong as to justify such a volte-face on how the balance should be struck. The evidence of this council certainly does not try to explain that. By paying lip service to the tilted balance, the chronic levels of housing need, and the urgency with which regeneration of the town is required, whilst offering no cogent assessment of how these factors should be weighed in the decision. But in any event, the proposals would place the right buildings in the right place at the time when regeneration is accepted to be urgent. This is a scheme which would give a great deal to Basildon, and the council now comes nowhere close to demonstrating that it takes anything significant away. We therefore respectfully ask you, sir, that this significant opportunity for the renewal of the town centre be grasped and this appeal be allowed. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Linus. Mr. Hill, Ms. Hall appearing. Yes, thank you. Can I thank all advocates for helpful, focused and well-referenced closing submissions. It's greatly appreciated and will be of assistance to me in my subsequent deliberations. Can I ask, are there any other matters? If not, I would just like to thank those who've assembled and maintained the document library. That's worked extremely well. And of course, the council for the manner in which they've hosted this virtual event.
Sir, on behalf of the appellant, can I thank you for the manner in which this inquiry has been conducted. It's not always easy virtually, particularly over an extended time period. And I know from our perspective, we've greatly appreciated the way in which you've held the inquiry over the days and weeks that it's been held.
Thank you. It's been greatly assisted by all those taking part, both in terms of advocates and witnesses, and I'm grateful for that. So an all-round effort, I think. If there's nothing further, thank you all very much. The inquiry is now closed.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.